Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Nightveil. Today we're covering 10 of the most disturbing true honeymoon cruise stories ever submitted to this channel. Newlyweds, crew members, and the people who sailed alongside them sent these in. And these aren't campfire inventions. Too specific, too consistent, too unsettling to dismiss. We cross-checked the details, and they line up with cruise line incident reports, crew logbooks, and Port Authority records. Please subscribe, turn the bell on, because this channel is about slow-burning authentic horror over cheap jump scares. And if something like this has ever happened to you, share your story in the comments. Your experience could be the next one we bring to light. The wedding was small, just 40 people at my parents' place outside Tampa, and 3 weeks later, we boarded the Solara Horizon out of Fort Lauderdale for a 7-night run through the Eastern Caribbean. Peak June, the kind of heat that sits on your skin even at 10 at night. We had a balcony suite on deck 10, aft, which the travel agent said was worth the upgrade because you get the wake view, the water folding out behind the ship, instead of just alongside it. Claire loved that view the first night. She stood out there with a glass of champagne going flat in her hand, and said this was the first time in her adult life she felt like nothing was chasing her. I remember laughing because it sounded like a line from a movie, and she laughed too, but a half-second late, like she'd surprised herself by saying it out loud. Day 2, we docked in Charlotte-Amalie, St. Thomas. We split up for about 90 minutes, me chasing down a specific rum for my father-in-law, her wandering the jewelry district near the cruise terminal because she wanted a pair of earrings to match the ring. When I found her again, she was sitting on a bench outside a shop that wasn't even open, and she wasn't looking at her phone, or the water, or anything in particular. She said she'd gotten turned around, that all the alleys looked the same up there, but something had rearranged itself behind her eyes in those 90 minutes. She was quieter at dinner. She pushed her food around. When I asked if she felt seasick, she said she was fine, just tired, and I believed her, because there was no reason not to. That night I woke up around 2 because she was talking. Not screaming, not thrashing, just talking, flat and clear, the way people talk when they're arguing with someone in a dream. She said, more than once, someone is waiting for me. I shook her shoulder, and she surfaced slow, confused, asked why I looked worried. I told her what she'd said, and she went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the dim cabin light. She said she'd had that dream before, on and off since she was a teenager, and she didn't like talking about it. So I let it go, because that's what you do on your honeymoon. You let things go. The next morning, brushing my teeth, I noticed her wedding ring sitting on the edge of the sink, and I picked it up to look at it properly, for maybe the first time since the ceremony. Engraved on the inside of the band, worn soft with age, were 2 initials that weren't hers and weren't mine, and a date, almost 6 years before we'd even met. When I asked her about it, she said it was her grandmother's ring, resized, that the initials belonged to her grandmother and a man she'd married before her actual grandfather, a marriage that ended fast and wasn't discussed. It was a reasonable answer. I filed it away and didn't think about it again until much later, when I had to. Night 2. Deep into the second half of the trip, I woke up because the balcony door was open and the curtain was moving. Claire was standing at the railing in her sleep shirt, both hands flat on the metal, not climbing, not leaning, just standing there facing the dark water, like she was waiting for a bus. I said her name twice before she turned around, and when she did, her face had no recognition in it at all, not for a second and a half that felt much longer. Then she blinked, and it was her again, and she asked why we were both up, and had no memory of walking out there. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I told myself it was stress, the wedding, the heat, and she agreed. And we didn't talk about it again either. It was the next afternoon, the 2 of us lying on the bed during the hottest part of the day, when she made me promise something. She took my hand, laced our fingers together in that specific way she did when she wanted my full attention, and said if anything ever happened to her, if she ever went missing or disappeared or anything like that, she needed me to promise I would never go looking. Not police, not private investigators, nothing. Just let it be. I laughed at first, told her that was a strange thing to make a new husband swear to, and she didn't laugh back. She said it again, slower, and made me say the words. I said them because I loved her, and because I assumed it came from some old family scar tissue I hadn't gotten to yet. Some story about her father, or an uncle that would come out eventually, over years, the way those stories do in a marriage. I had no idea I was making a promise that would define the rest of my life. Night 3. I went to sleep with her curled against my back, her breathing slow and even, and I woke up at 6:40 because the light through the balcony door had changed. The bed beside me was cold, in a way that meant hours, not minutes. The balcony door was unlocked, slid all the way open, curtain pinned back by the humidity. Her wedding ring sat on the railing, centered, deliberate, not dropped or knocked loose, placed. I said her name into an empty cabin, and the sound of my own voice coming back at me is the last thing from that morning I remember with any real clarity. Security arrived within 10 minutes, and within 20 the ship had gone into its search protocol, the Williamson turn, cutting back along its own wake, while crew combed every deck, every stairwell, every lifeboat station. Nothing. No one had seen her. The muster stations were checked cabin by cabin. By mid-morning, the captain had notified the Coast Guard, and we were holding position roughly 40 miles northeast of where we'd been at midnight, drifting in a slow circle, while helicopters made passes over water that gave back nothing but light. I stood at that same railing for hours, watching men in orange search a stretch of ocean the exact color of the inside of her eyelids, and felt nothing, which is its own kind of horror. The numbness arriving before the grief has anywhere to land. 2 days in, the ship's chief security officer let me sit with him and review the corridor footage from outside our suite. Standard procedure, he said, more for the file than for me. The timestamp on the footage matched our door, matched the hour, showed nothing unusual, no one entering or leaving after I'd gone to bed. But the officer frowned at something on his second pass and pulled up the ship's navigational log beside it. The GPS position embedded in the security system's metadata for that footage placed the Solara horizon almost 90 miles from where the bridge log showed we actually were at that hour. He said it had to be a syncing error, a known glitch, with the new system they'd installed that spring. I nodded because there was nothing else to do with that information. But it sat in me wrong, like a key that fits a lock but won't turn. A private investigator I hired. Once we were back on land, a woman named Teresa, who used to do skip tracing before she went independent, got into Claire's phone backup with a warrant assist from the family. Buried in the drafts folder, sent through the ship's satellite Wi-Fi at 1:47 that final morning, and then deleted, were 3 fragments of a message to a contact, saved only as a single letter, W. 2 of the fragments were unreadable, corrupted in the recovery. The third said, in full, "I can't keep doing this to him. He doesn't know." The bartender who'd worked the aft lounge on Deck 9 for 6 seasons, a man named Dario who mixed us drinks most nights of the cruise, stopped me on our 3rd day back on the ship, before we disembarked for good, and said something that took weeks to fully land. He said he recognized my wife from a cruise 2 summers before. Same ship, different name on the manifest, sitting at his bar 3 nights running, always alone. I told him he was mistaken, that this was Claire's first time on a ship in her life, her first time on the ocean at all, something she'd told me and her family and everyone at the wedding shower more than once. He shrugged, like a man who knew what he'd seen, but wasn't going to argue with a husband 3 days into losing his wife. When her belongings were shipped home from the Port Authority, I went through her suitcase alone one night, mostly to have something to do with my hands. Folded into the lining of a garment bag, behind a zipper I hadn't known was there, was a single photograph, creased soft from being carried. Claire, younger, hair a different length, standing on a balcony that belonged to a different ship entirely, judging by the railing style and the lifeboat visible in the corner. On the back, in pencil, a date 4 years before the night we met. On her hand in the photo, unmistakable even in the low light, was the same ring that had been left on our railing. That sent me into every document I could legally pull: birth certificate requests, Old school records her mother eventually, reluctantly, helped me track down. I found a name discrepancy on a decade-old lease agreement, a maiden name that wasn't the one on our marriage license, filed under Dana instead of Claire. Her mother, when I finally asked her directly, went quiet for a long time on the phone, and then told me Claire had a younger sister once. A sister who died young, in a way the family never discussed in detail, somewhere near water, and that Claire had changed in the years after. Changed enough that her mother sometimes felt she was looking at a stranger wearing her daughter's face. The official case closed 9 days after we docked. Presumed accidental fall, possibly linked to a documented history of sleepwalking. Insufficient evidence of foul play. No body recovered in a current pattern that made recovery statistically unlikely past the first week. The cruise line settled with the family quietly, the kind of settlement that comes with paperwork asking you not to discuss the number. I flew home to an apartment that still had her toothbrush in the cup by the sink, and I went numb in a way that felt less like grief and more like standing very still so something enormous wouldn't notice me. 4 months later, I got a call from a blocked number that hung up the second I answered, and then a small charge appeared and vanished from a joint account we'd never fully closed. $42 at a pharmacy in a city I didn't recognize. Refunded within the hour, like someone had changed their mind about spending it, or about being seen spending it. She used to joke, early in our relationship, about the cities she'd disappear to if she ever needed to start over. Always said with a little laugh, like it was a game. Cartagena, Willemstad, maybe San Juan, if she wanted to stay close enough to visit her mother without anyone knowing. I started checking obituaries in those cities the way other people check the weather. A habit that embarrassed me enough that I never told anyone, not even Teresa. 8 months in, a small paper out of Willemstad ran an obituary for a woman with a first name 1 letter off from hers, and a birth year 2 years wrong. And I sat with that page open on my laptop for 11 hours before I let myself admit it wasn't her, and that some part of me had wanted it to be, because a grave is at least a place to stand. It was Teresa, almost a year to the day after the disappearance, who told me a woman had reached out to her office directly, asking careful questions about the case, refusing to give a last name, saying only that she'd known Claire years earlier under a different name and needed to know if the story in the news was true. When Teresa finally got her on a call with me listening, the woman, who gave only Ada, said she'd known Claire as Dana, back when Dana was 24, and running from a man named Warren Cole, who had put her in the hospital twice, and had money and patience enough to keep finding her, no matter how far she ran. Ada said Dana had disappeared once already, years before I ever met her, with help from people Ada wouldn't name, and had come back out the other side as Claire, clean, careful, a whole new documented life. Ada said the last time she'd heard from her, a few weeks before my wedding, Claire had used one phrase that Ada never forgot. She'd said, "I think he found me again." That was when the dream stopped being a dream to me. Someone is waiting for me wasn't a metaphor built out of anxiety or sleep deprivation. It was a fact she'd been carrying quietly through our entire relationship, through the proposal, through the wedding, through the packing of a honeymoon suitcase. And she had married me anyway, hoping, I think, that it would stay buried, that the version of her life she'd built with me would hold. Understanding that reframed everything. She hadn't gone quiet after St. Thomas because of a bad 90 minutes lost in an alley. Someone had seen her there, or she'd seen someone, and the 90 minutes had been spent deciding what to do about it. The sleepwalking wasn't sleepwalking at all, not fully. It was a woman rehearsing an exit her body already knew was coming before her mind had finished admitting it. And the promise she'd extracted from me wasn't the residue of some private family trauma I'd never get to hear the rest of. It was the only thing she could give me that might keep me alive, if Warren Cole ever decided I was worth looking at twice. A husband asking too many questions in the wrong direction. The CCTV discrepancy stopped being a software glitch the day Teresa found, through a source she wouldn't name in detail, that the ship's IT contractor that season had a side history helping exactly this kind of disappearance. Women moving through a network that used cruise ships as a blind spot on purpose, Because a body lost at sea generates paperwork instead of an investigation. Because a search that turns up nothing gets closed by law within a set number of days, almost no matter what. Someone on that ship had bought Claire 90 miles and several hours of confusion, long enough for a small boat or a float plane, or nothing more dramatic than a life vest and a current that was, that week, running steadily toward a shipping lane. 14 months after the wedding, Claire's oldest friend, Priya, the woman who'd stood beside her at the altar, came to my apartment holding an envelope she said had been mailed to her the week before our cruise, with instructions not to open it unless she didn't hear from Claire by a certain date, a date that had long since passed, while Priya, grieving in her own way, hadn't been able to make herself open it. Inside was a letter in Claire's handwriting, dated the week of the wedding. It didn't explain everything. It said she loved me, that none of it had been a performance, that marrying me had been the truest thing she'd done in years, even knowing what she might have to do after. It said she was sorry for the promise she'd made me keep, and asked me to keep keeping it, because looking for her was the one thing that could still get either of us killed. I understood then that the promise had never been about her disappearing into whatever grief or shame I'd assumed lived in her past. It had been the last protective thing she could do for me, a wall built out of a single sentence, meant to stand between me and a man I would never meet and never be able to defend myself against. I kept the promise. I want to say that plainly, because it's the only part of this I got right. I stopped hiring investigators. I stopped checking the obituaries so often, though I never fully stopped. I let the file stay closed, the way she'd asked, the way the state had already decided it should be. 5 years after the wedding, I was in Cartagena for work, a conference that had nothing to do with any of this, and I was walking through the old walled city in the late afternoon when I saw a woman across a crowded plaza, holding the hand of a small boy, maybe 4 years old, and something in the set of her shoulders turned my whole body cold before my mind caught up. She wasn't looking for me. She was laughing at something the boy had said, her hair shorter, a name tag from some local school or clinic, clipped to her shirt that I was too far away to read. For 1 second, no more, her eyes crossed the plaza and found mine, and there was no surprise in them at all, only a kind of tired, aching recognition, like she'd always known this particular afternoon was somewhere out there waiting for both of us. She didn't smile. She gave the smallest possible dip of her chin, the exact gesture she used to make across restaurant tables when she wanted me to know she was fine without saying it out loud. Then she turned back to the boy, and the crowd moved, the way crowds do, and by the time it thinned again, she was gone. I didn't follow her. I stood in that plaza until the light changed, and then I went back to my hotel, and the next morning I flew home, and I have never told anyone what I saw that day, except the version I'm telling now. I still don't know the whole shape of what she ran from, or what she had to become to survive it, or whether the boy was hers, or whose. I know only that she was alive, that she had built something new out of whatever was left of her, and that somewhere she is still keeping her own half of the promise, the half that says, "Stay gone so he stays safe." I check the obituaries less than I used to. Some part of me still can't stop. The wedding package included 4 days of professional photography, and Claire had rolled her eyes at Mark when he signed them up for it back in Athens, standing in line at check-in with their suitcases still tagged from the airport. She thought it would be some tired man in a Hawaiian shirt snapping forced smiles at dinner. Instead, there was Andreas, quiet and precise, who appeared at the gangway before they'd even found their cabin, and told her, without her having said a word, that she took her coffee black with 1 sugar. She laughed it off. "Lucky guess," she told Mark later. "Ship photographers probably watch 2,000 people a day. You learn to read faces." The next morning, she went down to the gallery deck to look at the first batch of prints clipped along the display wall, expecting the usual embarkation shots, her and Mark grinning under the ship's name in wet paint letters. She found herself in a photo from before that, a wide shot of the terminal building in Piraeus, taken from an angle above the crowd, time-stamped 2 hours before they'd boarded. She was in the frame, small but unmistakably her, standing at the edge of a group of strangers, looking at something off camera. She hadn't seen anyone with a camera up there. When she brought it to the desk, a woman with a name tag that said Ismini looked at the timestamp, shrugged, and said the system sometimes glitched on daylight savings crossovers, that it happened more than people realized. Claire took the explanation because it was easier than the alternative, and because the ship was beautiful, and because she was newly married and did not want to spend her honeymoon suspicious of a stranger. By the second day, in Santorini, she'd almost forgotten it. She and Mark took the cable car down to the old port, wandered the white streets with 300 other tourists, doing exactly the same thing, and at some point on the cliff path above the caldera, she turned, and there he was again, not the excursion photographer, who was a heavy-set man near the donkey trail handing out flyers for prints. Andreas, off to the side, camera raised, getting a shot of her with the volcano behind her. He wasn't assigned to shore excursions. She knew this, because she'd asked, out of simple curiosity. And the answer she got from a deckhand was that the photography team rotated and she shouldn't read too much into who showed up where. But when she pressed, asking specifically about Andreas, the deckhand's easy tone dropped a register, and he said only that Andreas kept to himself and went back to coiling a rope, like the conversation had ended itself. The first gift came that evening, a small shell, pale and ridged, sitting on the carpet outside her cabin door, like it had been placed there rather than dropped. She thought a child from a neighboring cabin had left it, some sweet accident, and didn't think about it again until 2 nights later, when there was something else. A printed photograph, 4 by 6, tucked half under the door. In it she was 7 or 8 years old, wearing a yellow raincoat, standing in front of a house she recognized instantly because she had grown up in it, on a street in the north of England that had nothing to do with cruise ships or the Aegean Sea or anyone she had met in the last 10 years of her life. She brought it to Mark in their cabin, her hand not quite steady, and he turned it over, checked the back, found nothing, and told her it was probably something her mother had sent ahead, a surprise arranged before the wedding. When she said her mother didn't know their cabin number, didn't know Andreas existed, he told her she was tired, that weddings did strange things to people's nerves, that she should try to enjoy the trip instead of building a mystery out of a shell and a photograph. It was the first time since the wedding that she felt truly alone in a room with him. She went back to the gallery the next morning by herself, while Mark slept off the ouzo from the night before, and asked to look through the archive bins where they kept the older stock prints, the ones from past seasons that never sold. Ismini let her, distracted by a line of people wanting formal portraits. 2 folders in, Claire found it. A photograph on paper stock that didn't match anything else in the bin, slightly yellowed at the corners, of a narrow residential street with terraced houses and a red postbox on the corner. It took her a full minute standing there before her stomach dropped through the floor, because she knew that postbox. She had walked past it every day of her childhood, and there was no possible way a ship's photography archive from a Greek cruise line had a picture of it. She checked the sleeve it came in. A faded stamp on the back read a year, that put it a full decade before Andreas could have been old enough to hold a camera professionally, let alone work this route. She told herself lookalikes existed, that postboxes were not unique, that jet lag and grief for her old single life were doing something strange to her perception, and she put the photo back exactly where she found it, and left the gallery telling herself she would not go back down there again. 2 days later, crossing between decks on the way to breakfast, the ship rolled hard through a patch of chop nobody had warned them about, and she lost her footing on the wet steel of an outer stairwell. A hand closed around her arm before she went down, steady, sure, and when she looked up it was Andreas, saying nothing, just holding her until she found her balance again. She thanked him, and he nodded once and walked away, and for the rest of that day, she found herself unable to decide whether she was more afraid of him or grateful to him, which frightened her more than either feeling alone. She asked at guest services for his full name and department, framing it as wanting to leave a positive review. The officer at the desk typed for a while, frowned, typed again, and told her there was no one by that name currently rostered to the photography team. She described him in detail: the build, the accent, the small scar above his left eyebrow, and the officer's face changed in a way she recognized from years of watching people decide how much to tell her. He said he'd have to check with the department head and would follow up, and never did. That night, a cabin steward she'd built a small rapport with over the week, a young woman named Petra, told her quietly, while turning down the bed, that there had been a man on the photography team the season before who'd used a different first name entirely and had been moved between 3 ships in 18 months, and that nobody on staff liked to talk about why. She wouldn't say more than that, glancing at the door twice while she spoke, and Claire understood she'd been told exactly as much as she was going to be told. She found him alone in the gallery 2 nights later, after the evening show had let out, and the corridor lights had dimmed to their overnight setting, sorting prints into envelopes under a single lamp. She hadn't planned the confrontation. It simply happened, her feet carrying her there before her nerve could catch up with her body, and she asked him, flatly, why he kept photographing her, why there were pictures of her from before she'd boarded, why there was a picture of the street she grew up on sitting in his archive. He didn't act surprised. He didn't act guilty either, which was somehow worse. He set down the envelope in his hand and told her, in the same even voice he used to direct people into frame, that they had met before. Not recently. Not on this ship. Years ago, in a place she wouldn't expect, under circumstances she clearly didn't remember. And he said it the way a person states a fact they've long since made peace with, not the way a person spins a lie they're hoping will land. She told him that was impossible, that she would remember, and he reached into a drawer beneath the counter and took out a single photograph, worn soft at the edges, the way old photographs get from being handled too many times, and set it in front of her. It was her, unmistakably younger, at what looked like a school fair or a village fete, standing beside a boy who could only have been him at perhaps 14, both of them squinting into the sun. On the back, in pencil, was a date and a place name she didn't recognize, but that made her chest go tight anyway, because the handwriting looked distantly, uncomfortably like her own childhood scrawl. She left without answering him and didn't sleep that night, and the next morning, before she could stop herself, she called her mother from the ship's satellite line and asked, without explaining why, whether they had ever gone to a village fete near a place with that name, sometime around when she was 10. There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that Claire thought the call had dropped, and then her mother said quietly that they had, once, for a cousin's wedding, and asked why on earth she was bringing it up now, 4,000 miles away, in the middle of her honeymoon. Something surfaced in Claire then that she couldn't fully hold on to, a fragment rather than a memory, the smell of cut grass, and a boy handing her a paper cup of lemonade, gone again before she could look at it directly, and it did nothing to settle her. If anything, it was worse than not remembering at all, because now, some part of her believed him, and believing him meant something had been quietly true about her own life, for over a decade without her ever knowing it. She told Mark everything that morning, all of it, the photographs, the gift, the street, the photograph he'd shown her, and this time he didn't dismiss it, his face going still and careful, in a way she hadn't seen from him before. But underneath his concern, she caught something else, a flicker of a question he didn't ask out loud, about why she looked more shaken than relieved now that there was an explanation on the table, about what exactly it meant that a stranger seemed to know more about her own childhood than she did. They went to ship security together that afternoon, and the officer who took the report, a heavy-set man with a tired patience about him, listened to the whole thing without much visible reaction, until Claire mentioned Andreas by name, at which point he closed his notebook briefly and asked her to wait. When he came back, he told her, choosing his words with obvious care, that there had been a similar complaint 2 seasons earlier, on a different ship, involving a passenger who had also reported feeling, followed by a member of the photography staff, and that the situation had been handled quietly at the time. He wouldn't say what handled meant. He wrote down her report and told her the matter would be looked into. By the time they docked at the next port, Rhodes, in the flat gold light of early afternoon, Andreas was gone. Not detained, not questioned in front of her, nothing so satisfying as an arrest. His cabin had simply been cleared out overnight, his name pulled from the crew boards, and when she asked a staff member what had happened, she got the same practiced blankness she'd learned to expect from this ship. A shrug, a line about internal reassignments, a suggestion that she try to enjoy the rest of her trip. Nobody would confirm he'd done anything wrong. Nobody would confirm he hadn't. He had simply been removed, the way a stain is removed, without anyone discussing what had caused it. She spent the last 2 days of the cruise waiting for something else to happen, and nothing did. No gifts, no photographs, no glimpse of him at the edge of a crowd. And by the time they reached the final morning, packing their cases in the gray light of an interior cabin that had never once let in the sun, she'd almost convinced herself it was over. That whatever he had wanted, whatever debt or delusion had driven him, had ended when the ship pulled the badge from his hand. The wedding photo package arrived by email 3 weeks later. Back home, a digital gallery of every image the ship's photographers had taken of her and Mark across the whole voyage, curated and ready to order as prints. She went through it slowly one evening while Mark was still at work, reliving the trip in reverse, and near the very end of the folder, time-stamped the morning they disembarked in Rhodes, hours after Andreas's cabin had already been cleared. There was one more photograph of her, alone, walking down the gangway with her suitcase, unaware of the camera. Composed exactly the way all his others had been, that same specific angle he always used, low and slightly to the left, and she sat there in her kitchen a long time, with the laptop open in front of her, unable to decide whether it meant someone else on that crew had simply learned to shoot the way he did, or whether he had never really left the ship at all before that photo was taken, and she understood, closing the laptop without ordering a single print, that she was never going to know which of those two answers was true, and that not knowing was going to be the thing she carried instead of an ending. The charter boat was called the Whisper Reach, 52 feet of white fiberglass and teak trim, and Ryan had picked it because the broker swore the out islands in July would be empty enough that his family could have the whole anchorage to themselves. He hadn't accounted for how small 52 feet actually feels once you pack it with his parents. Elise's parents, her sister Priya, and Marcus, who'd been Ryan's best friend since they were 9 years old, and who insisted, the second they stepped aboard in Marsh Harbor, that he take the cabin, wedged directly between the newlyweds' berth and the parents' suite. "Makes sense," Marcus said, already hauling his duffel down the companionway. "I'm the buffer. Keep the old folks from hearing anything they don't want to hear." Everyone laughed. Ryan laughed too. It was the kind of joke Marcus had always made, the kind that let him plant himself in the middle of things without anyone questioning why. The first 2 days were what a honeymoon/family reunion was supposed to look like. They snorkeled a blue hole off Staniel Cay, ate grouper sandwiches with sand still on their feet, and at night, the boat rocked gently at anchor, while Ryan lay next to his wife of 9 days and thought that this, finally, was the beginning of the actual rest of his life. It was Marcus who suggested, both nights, a group activity right when Ryan had planned to slip away with Elise, a sunset paddleboard run the first night, a bonfire on the beach the second, framed each time as something the family had been dying to do together. "You've got the rest of your lives to be alone," Marcus said, grinning, an arm slung around Ryan's shoulders. "Give your mom one more night of feeling like she hasn't lost you." Ryan went along with it both times, because refusing felt selfish, and because Marcus had a way of making generosity look like sacrifice. The tickets went missing on the 3rd morning. Ryan had booked a private snorkel charter to a reef nobody else went to, printed the confirmation himself, and tucked it into the file folder Marcus had volunteered to hold on to since he was the one with the actual filing system. When Ryan asked for it at breakfast, Marcus patted his cargo shorts, checked the folder twice, and came up empty. "I swear I had it," he said, and he looked genuinely rattled, enough that Ryan apologized for even bringing it up. They ended up on the standard reef trip with 11 other tourists instead, and Marcus spent the whole ride out talking to Elise's father about grouper migration patterns, loud enough that Ryan couldn't get a private word in with his own wife the entire crossing. It kept happening in smaller ways. Ryan would try to talk to Marcus about the marriage, how strange and good it felt to be someone's husband, how he wanted Marcus's honest take on whether he was doing okay by Elise, and Marcus would pivot, every time, to a story from high school, something that made them both laugh and made the real conversation evaporate. Ryan noticed it, and then talked himself out of noticing it. That was just how Marcus was. He'd never been a talk about your feelings guy. The first mate's name was Tobias, a lean, sun-cracked islander who'd been running charters out of Georgetown for 11 years, and on the fourth afternoon, while Ryan was coiling a dock line beside him, Tobias said, without looking up, "Your friend." "The tall one. He been on this boat a lot when you two aren't around." Ryan asked what he meant. Tobias just shrugged and said, "Just watch him," and went back to the winch. And when Ryan pushed for more, the man got quiet, in a way that seemed less like he had nothing to say, and more like he'd already decided he'd said enough. That night, Ryan noticed his suitcase zipper was on the wrong side, the little brass pull facing the hinge instead of away from it, the way he always left it. He stood there for a second with a strange cold drop in his stomach, then decided he was being paranoid on a boat where 6 people shared 3 bathrooms, and anyone could have bumped it moving through the cabin. Elise started going quiet around Marcus. Not cold, not obvious, just a beat too careful. Her answers to his jokes shorter than they used to be, her eyes finding the horizon instead of his face. Ryan chalked it up to the cramped quarters wearing on everyone. At dinner on the 5th night, over conch fritters and too much rum punch, Marcus told Priya a story about how Ryan used to be terrified his own father thought he was a disappointment, a thing Ryan had told him once, drunk, at 2 in the morning, years ago, in confidence. He told it like a fond, funny anecdote. Elise's face didn't move, but Ryan saw her hand tighten around her glass, and later, alone, she asked him quietly why Marcus knew things about him that she didn't. Ryan didn't have a good answer. The walls between the cabins were thin enough that Ryan could hear his father-in-law's snoring from 2 doors down, and at 2 in the morning on the 6th night, he woke to the low murmur of Marcus's voice through the bulkhead, on a call with someone, the words too muffled to catch except for one, clear as a struck bell in the middle of a sentence, Elise's name. He lay there a long time before he decided it meant nothing. Family trip, everyone talks about everyone. Marcus was probably telling some girl back home a story about the wedding. He brought it up to Elise anyway, the next morning, on deck, quietly, so no one else could hear. He expected her to laugh it off. Instead, she went very still and said, "Just leave it, Ryan. He's under a lot of pressure right now, okay? Don't make this a thing." It was the wrongness of her tone, more than the words, that stuck with him. Not annoyed, protective of Marcus, in a way that made no sense to Ryan at all, and he spent the rest of the morning turning that over like a stone in his pocket. He went looking in the folder again that afternoon, the one with the lost tickets, and found the tickets. They'd been there the whole time, tucked behind a laminated tide chart, along with something that hadn't been there before, a printout of their entire honeymoon itinerary for the following month, the one only Ryan and Elise had, with small pencil notes in the margins beside certain dates. Flight numbers. A hotel name circled twice. He confronted Marcus that evening on the aft deck, kept his voice low, asked him straight out if something was going on. Marcus didn't get angry. He got hurt, which was worse, his eyes going wet in a way Ryan had only seen once before, at his own mother's funeral. "I'm losing you, man," Marcus said. "You get that, right? 20 years, and now I'm the guy who gets fit in between family dinners." He said he'd printed the itinerary because he wanted to plan a surprise, a gift, something to send ahead to the hotel. Ryan believed him, or told himself he did, and felt sick with guilt for having doubted a man who'd stood beside him at the altar a week and a half earlier. Tobias found him alone at the helm the next morning, coiling line again, like it was the only excuse he needed to talk. This time he didn't hedge. "I saw him go into your cabin yesterday," he said, "while you and your wife were down at the dive site. Wasn't grabbing gear. Wasn't in a hurry either. He was in there 20 minutes. Ryan checked. Marcus said he'd needed a spare life vest, that theirs was the only cabin with extras. It was a reasonable answer, but Elise's journal, the leather one she kept on the shelf above the bunk, had been moved from where she always left it, spine out, to lying flat, and when Ryan picked it up to set it right, it fell open on its own to a page near the middle, and before he closed it, out of some respect for her that he was already starting to regret, he saw one line, just one, enough to catch a name. Not his. He didn't say anything to her about it. He told himself it wasn't his business, that a journal was private even from a husband, and he sat with that name lodged in his chest like a fishbone for the rest of the day. It was Elise's mother, of all people, who cracked the first real seam, over coffee the next morning, while Elise was still asleep. "It's sweet having Marcus along," she said, watching the water. "Takes her back. She and I used to joke that college would have turned out different if she'd stuck with the philosophy crowd instead of business." Ryan asked what she meant. She waved a hand, already moving on to something about the weather. "Oh, you know, before your time. She and Marcus overlapped a year at State before he transferred out." Ryan sat with his coffee going cold and did the math 3 separate times, because it refused to add up cleanly the first 2. Marcus had told him they met for the first time at Ryan's own 25th birthday party. Elise had said the same thing, more than once, in front of other people, at their engagement dinner even. Neither of them had ever mentioned State. He asked her directly that afternoon, in the cabin, door shut, voice as even as he could keep it. She went pale, then defensive, then almost pleading, all in the space of 30 seconds. Yes, she'd known Marcus before. It had been brief. It hadn't mattered. She hadn't told Ryan because there had genuinely been nothing to tell, and she hated that he was looking at her like there was. He believed her, because the alternative was unbearable, and he apologized for pushing, and he hated himself a little for the relief he felt when she cried and he got to be the one comforting her instead of the one asking harder questions. The 7th day was supposed to be easy, a sandbar picnic a few miles out, the kind of shallow silver flat that appears at low tide and vanishes a few hours later. Marcus offered to take Ryan out in the dinghy first to scout it, just the 2 of them. Guy time, he called it, and Ryan went, grateful for something that felt like the old friendship. Marcus dropped him on the sandbar to check the depth on the far side, said he'd swing back around, and didn't. The tide was already turning by the time Ryan realized the dinghy wasn't coming back on any predictable schedule, and he stood there for over an hour, sunburning, watching the whisper reach a half-mile off, before Tobias finally noticed through the binoculars and sent the tender out. When Ryan climbed back aboard, salt-crusted and furious in a way he was trying hard to swallow, he found Marcus and Elise on the bow, heads bent close, voices low and fast, and the second his foot hit the deck, the conversation cut off like a switch had been thrown. Elise's face did something complicated, relief and guilt and fear, all at once, before she smoothed it into a smile and asked if he was okay. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in the dark listening through the wall, and this time Marcus wasn't being careful. His voice came through clear, raw, stripped of the jokes. "I can't just watch this happen," he said, to someone, or to himself. "You think I don't know what I sound like? I know exactly what I sound like." A pause, then quieter, worse. 6 years, and I never stopped. "And you're going to tell me that doesn't count for anything?" Ryan was up and through the door before he'd finished deciding to move. Marcus was alone in the cabin, sitting on the edge of his bunk with his phone in his lap. No call connected, no one on the other end. He'd been talking to no one, or to everyone. Elise appeared behind Ryan in the doorway a second later, drawn by the noise, and when she saw Marcus's face and then saw Ryan's, something in her seemed to give way, like she'd been holding a door shut for a week and had finally run out of strength in her arms. It came out in pieces, over the next 20 unbearable minutes, with the whole family gathering in the salon in various states of undress and horror. Marcus and Elise had dated for 8 months in college, before Ryan, before any of it, and it had ended badly. Elise's choice, not his. And Marcus had spent 6 years telling himself he was fine with it, all the way through being asked to be Ryan's best man, all the way through the wedding toast, where he'd called Elise the best thing that ever happened to his oldest friend. He hadn't been fine with it. He'd pushed to be included on this trip specifically, had angled for the middle cabin specifically, had lost the tickets and printed the itinerary, and scheduled the excursions, and stranded Ryan on that sandbar with a clarity of purpose that made Ryan's stomach turn when he finally saw the whole shape of it laid out. He'd been searching the cabin for a photo Elise had once given him. Something small and stupid and years old. An excuse, really. A reason to be near her things. Elise, for her part, had known something was wrong almost from the first missing ticket. She hadn't wanted to believe it was this. She'd been trying to manage Marcus quietly. Deflect him without blowing up the friendship Ryan valued so much. Protect Ryan from a truth she was praying she was wrong about. And every time Ryan had felt her go cagey or evasive, it hadn't been guilt. It had been her standing in front of a fire trying to put it out before he smelled the smoke. Ryan didn't remember crossing the salon. He remembered his father's hand on his chest, and Tobias's voice, sharp and close, and the taste of copper where he'd bitten the inside of his cheek. He didn't hit Marcus. He came close enough that the memory of how close would sit uneasily in him for a long time afterward. Close enough that Captain Reyes had already radioed ahead by the time the two men were pulled apart. Close enough that nobody argued when the captain said flatly that the boat would be putting in at the nearest settlement within the hour, and Marcus would be leaving it there. They dropped him at a dock on a small quay Ryan couldn't have found on a map a week earlier, his duffel thrown down after him onto sun-bleached planks, and the Whisper Reach pulled out on the tide without him, while he stood there getting smaller, not waving, just watching. The rest of the charter went quiet in a different way than before. Everyone gentle with each other. Careful. The kind of careful that comes after something breaks and gets set but hasn't fully healed. Elise and Ryan talked for hours that night, and the next day, and the day after that, and somewhere in it he understood that the marriage itself had never really been the thing at risk. What he'd lost was something else. 20 years of assuming he knew a person all the way down, and the reflex, the one he was going to have to relearn from nothing, of trusting his own gut over a familiar voice telling him he was overreacting. He thought about the crewman's warning he'd waved off twice, the suitcase he'd talked himself out of noticing, the itinerary notes he'd let Marcus explain away, and none of it made him feel angry anymore. It just made him feel like a man who'd been handed the truth in pieces, over and over, and had chosen, every single time, to hand it back. They finished the week in the islands because there was nowhere else to go, and it was, in its strange broken way, still a honeymoon. Elise's hand finding his on the rail at sunset, the water the same impossible color it had been the first night, before any of it. But Ryan noticed, sailing home, that he kept glancing at the empty middle cabin, and that the guilt wasn't really about Marcus at all. It was about how easy it had been to believe a familiar liar over an unfamiliar truth, and how long it was going to take him to trust his own eyes again. Elena booked the cruise as a surprise for their 15th anniversary, a slow loop through Alaska's Inside Passage before the summer crowds arrived, back when there was still snow, low on the mountains, and the ship was maybe 2/3 full. Mark had wanted somewhere warm. She'd wanted somewhere quiet. They compromised on neither, really, and ended up wrapped in the same fleece blankets they kept meaning to buy at home, gliding between islands in early April, while the water outside their balcony changed color depending on the light. The third night out, docked for a few hours in a small town she'd later have trouble picturing clearly. A man near the pier sold fresh mussels out of a cooler packed in ice, steamed to order right there on a portable burner, cheaper and better than anything on the ship's dinner menu. Mark bought a paper tray of them and ate most of it walking back up the gangway, talking with his mouth full about how much better they tasted than the ones from the dining room the night before. She remembers that detail with a strange specificity now, the exact spot on the pier where he stood eating them, the steam still coming off the shells. At the time it meant nothing, it was just dinner. By the time they sat down for the ship's actual dinner service that evening, he'd already had 2 servings of shellfish, and when he pushed his entree around his plate without eating much of it, she assumed he was full. He blamed the boat instead, the way people do. joking that his stomach had opinions about the swell they'd picked up once they cleared the sheltered water. Later, back in the cabin, he said the room felt like it was rocking more than it should. She told him it probably was. They'd moved into a stretch of open channel known for chop right around sunset. He lay down early, around 10. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that his lips felt strange, a kind of tingling, like the tail end of a dentist's local anesthetic wearing off. He rubbed his mouth and laughed about it. Guessed he was allergic to something in the seasoning. She laughed too. That's the part she goes back to most, the laughing. It stopped being funny fast. By 11, his fingertips had gone numb, not painfully, just absent, the way a foot feels after you've sat on it wrong for too long. He reached for a water bottle on the nightstand, and it slipped straight through his hand onto the carpet. She walked him down to the medical bay on deck 3, expecting motion sickness pills, and maybe a gentle joke from the night nurse about first-timers on rough water. The nurse on duty checked his blood pressure, his temperature, asked the routine questions, and landed on a stomach bug, compounded by the ship's stabilizers working overtime in the chop. She gave him something for nausea and something mild for motion sickness, told them both to get some sleep, said it would probably clear by morning. Elena believed her. There was no reason yet not to. The medication did exactly what it was meant to do. It settled his stomach and made him drowsy, and for a couple of hours, it looked like the nurse had been right. But sedating a body doesn't quiet what's underneath it. It just muffles the alarms that would otherwise have gone off sooner. By 2:30 in the morning, Mark woke her up trying to say her name and not quite managing the shape of the word. When she grabbed his hand, it barely closed around hers at all. They went back down, and this time it was the ship's doctor, a woman who did the kind of exam Elena had only ever seen from the doorway of an actual hospital room, tapping reflexes at his knees, his ankles, his elbows, testing his grip against her own palm, running a key along the sole of his foot, and watching his toes for a response. That didn't come the way it should have. The doctor's face didn't change dramatically. It changed enough. The story shifted right there from a stomach thing to a nervous system thing, and Elena felt the floor of the last several hours drop out from under her. The doctor asked what they'd eaten that day, going backward hour by hour, and when Elena mentioned the mussels from the dock vendor rather than the ship's own kitchen, the doctor stopped writing for a second. She asked how many he'd eaten. She asked if the vendor had a permit posted anywhere, which wasn't a question Elena had thought to look for at the time, because why would she have? The overhead speaker crackled awake around then, with the captain's voice, apologizing for the hour, explaining that a fast-moving low-pressure system was pushing through the strait ahead of them, and the ship would be holding position instead of making its scheduled port call in the morning, with updates to follow. It was routine phrasing, the kind most passengers hear, and roll over and go back to sleep to. Elena heard it standing in a medical bay, watching a doctor take her husband's blood pressure for the 3rd time in an hour, and she understood, before anyone explained it to her, that they were not getting off this boat tomorrow. The doctor sent someone to check the guest log for anyone else who'd mentioned the same vendor, and word came back that a couple 2 decks up had bought from the same cooler. The wife had some mild tingling in her lips she'd already mentioned to no one, because it felt too minor to bother with. Her husband, who'd eaten less than half of what Mark had nothing at all. It didn't explain why Mark was the one struggling to keep his eyes open on an exam table, but it told the doctor something. This wasn't a bug going around the ship. It was dose-dependent, and Mark had gotten the worst of it by a wide margin. Then, quietly, more thinking aloud than announcing anything, the doctor said the words paralytic shellfish poisoning, and something about a toxin called saxitoxin, about algae blooms along that stretch of coast in early spring that concentrate in shellfish before anyone can tell just by looking at them, about towns further up the passage that close their beaches to harvesting every few years for exactly this reason. Closures a man selling out of a cooler with no permit would have no way of knowing about, or no reason to mention if he did. Elena asked, in the flat, functional voice a person uses when they're trying not to feel a question yet, whether it could affect his breathing. The doctor didn't soften it. In severe cases, yes. The toxin worked on nerves the same way, regardless of which nerves they were, and the ones running his diaphragm weren't exempt from that. That was the first time anyone in the room said the word respiratory, and once it was said, it didn't stop being present. The next step in Elena's mind was simple. Get him off the boat. She asked about the helicopter, the one she'd glanced at on a safety diagram their first day aboard, and assumed existed for exactly this kind of situation. The answer came back within the hour, relayed down from the bridge. Coast Guard air assets for that stretch of the passage were grounded. The same storm system delaying their port call, keeping every aircraft in the region on the ground. No estimate yet for when that might change. The doctor, to her credit, didn't pretend otherwise to keep Elena calm. She said plainly that in 6 years on this route she'd handled seasickness, a broken wrist, one cardiac event, and nothing that looked like this, a paralysis moving this fast with no antidote she could give him, and that she needed someone with more specialized knowledge than she had. She got on the satellite phone to try to reach a toxicologist on shore. The connection kept failing. Not fully dead, just bad enough to be worse than dead, cutting in and out with the same interference grounding the helicopters. So instructions came through in fragments. Half a sentence about supportive care, a dropped call, a callback. Half a sentence about monitoring oxygen saturation, another drop. Elena stood in the corner of the room listening to a doctor take orders from static. They clipped a pulse oximeter to Mark's finger and left it there. And Elena found herself watching the number the way she'd have watched a countdown clock. Not because anyone told her to, but because it was the one piece of information in the room she could actually read without a medical degree. 96 became 94, became 91. Over the course of an hour that felt considerably longer than an hour. The doctor made the call to intubate him before he lost the ability to protect his own airway, rather than after, while he could still follow simple instructions, while there was still a version of this that was a controlled procedure, instead of an emergency one. It was the kind of decision Elena only understood much later to be the right one. A doctor choosing to act early and hard on a ship, with no backup plan if it went wrong, because the alternative arrived with no warning at all. It was around then, listening to a clipped exchange between the doctor and a crew member from engineering, that Elena learned the ship carried exactly one ventilator built for anything beyond short-term use, and a limited run of oxygen tanks meant for situations that resolved within a day, not for an open-ended wait on weather with no promised end. They asked her to step outside for the procedure itself, and she did, because there wasn't another option that made sense, and she stood in a hallway on deck 3, listening to low mechanical sounds behind a closed door, and understood for the first time in her life what it felt like to be entirely useless to the person she loved most. By morning, word came that the storm wasn't clearing in a matter of hours the way the earlier forecast had suggested. The system had stalled, and the new estimate put clearance somewhere between 18 and 24 hours out, which was a very different number than the one she'd built her hope around 6 hours earlier. The captain didn't wait passively on the weather. He altered course away from the printed itinerary, angling toward the nearest point of land that might shorten any future evacuation, moving the ship itself as far as physics and a storm would allow, which Elena appreciated even through the numbness, because it was the first thing anyone had done that felt like fighting instead of waiting. The nearest point of land turned out to be a fishing village, small enough that its whole population could fit in the ship's dining room twice over, and its clinic, when the bridge radioed ahead to check, had less equipment than the ship already did. Getting to shore wouldn't solve anything on its own. What they needed instead was a Coast Guard cutter close enough to attempt a transfer at sea, someone to come to them, since no single point on the map actually had what Mark needed. The cutter that could reach them fastest radioed back with its own bad news. Swell height in the strait was running past what they considered safe for a personnel transfer right then, and they'd need either the weather or the sea state to ease before they could risk it, whichever came first. Somewhere in the stretch of hours that followed, sitting beside a bed with a stranger's machine breathing for her husband, Elena found herself thinking about a work deadline of his from 6 weeks earlier, the one that had nearly made them cancel this trip entirely, the one he'd stayed up 2 nights straight to finish so they could still go. If he hadn't cleared it in time, they'd have rescheduled for June. and none of this would be happening. And the thought sat in her chest, without resolving into anything useful, just a fact she couldn't put down. Past noon, with the sedation eased back slightly so the doctor could check his responsiveness, Mark's eyes opened partway and found her across the room, and his hand, when she took it, managed something that wasn't quite a grip, but wasn't nothing either. A faint pressure she chose to believe was intentional. The oxygen supply came up again as the afternoon wore on. A specific number of hours of tank capacity mentioned between the doctor and a crew member, in a tone too careful to be casual, and Elena understood without needing it spelled out that everyone in that room was now watching 2 clocks at once, his body and the equipment keeping it going. The break, when it came, wasn't dramatic. The swell dropped by just enough for the cutter's crew to call it workable, and within the hour, there were strangers in survival suits on the ship's lower deck, helping move Mark, still on the ventilator, into a rescue basket rigged for exactly this kind of transfer, lowering him toward a smaller vessel, pitching hard enough that Elena had to look away twice. She rowed across holding a rail with both hands, not trusting her legs to do it for her. He survived the transfer, and the ambulance ride from the dock to the regional hospital, and 3 more days on a ventilator there before he could breathe fully on his own again, though it took longer than that for real strength to come back into his hands. There's a slight tremor in his right one now that wasn't there before the trip, and the neurologist says it may or may not fade with time. He's fine now, by every measure that matters. Back at work. Back to complaining that the dock muscles were better than the dining rooms whenever the story comes up at dinner parties, which it does, because people ask. And he tells it like a story now, with a shape and a punchline. Elena laughs along at the right points. What she doesn't mention, because there's no natural place for it in a dinner party version of events, is that she can't look at a marine weather forecast anymore without her chest going tight. That some mornings, even now, in a city nowhere near a coastline, she checks the barometric pressure on her phone before she can talk herself out of it and go on with her day. We booked the crossing because it was cheaper than flying, and because Daniel's grandmother used to talk about crossing the Atlantic by ship like it was the only civilized way to travel, and we thought it would be romantic to do it once, the old way, on one of the last liners still making the run in winter. It had been restored a few years back, brought back from a scrapyard in Genoa, piece by piece, and the brochure made a big deal out of how they'd kept the original cabin doors, the original brass, even the original paint colors, matched from chips found under decades of repainting. We'd booked an inside cabin on Deck 9, nothing special, budget class. And when we checked in at Southampton, the man behind the desk looked at our names on the screen, looked at us, looked back at the screen, and told us there'd been a complimentary upgrade, Deck 2, a legacy suite. He said it in a strange, careful way, like he was reciting something he'd been told to say, rather than something he believed. And when I asked why us, out of everyone in line, he just smiled and said the ship liked to reward young couples on their first crossing. I remember thinking at the time that it was a nice line for a brochure. I didn't think about how he hadn't actually answered the question. The suite itself was beautiful, in a way that felt almost like a museum exhibit you were allowed to sleep in. Walnut paneling, a round porthole instead of a window, a bathtub with clawed feet, brass fixtures gone soft and buttery with age and polish. The first night we lay there, giddy on the strangeness of it, the engine sounds so much quieter than either of us expected, and somewhere around midnight, we heard the people next door, a woman laughing, low and delighted, a man's voice underneath it, the specific clink of a bottle against glass, and then quiet. And then what was unmistakably the sound of 2 people beginning a wedding night. We looked at each other and laughed about it, newlyweds ourselves, feeling almost solidarity with whoever was on the other side of that wall. Then Daniel got up to see if he could find a spare blanket in the closet, and he put his hand flat on the wall between our suite and theirs, just idly, and told me it was cold. Not thin wall cold, steel cold, structural cold, and when he knocked on it, it didn't sound like a partition at all. It sounded solid the whole way through. the way you'd expect a hull wall to sound, not something with a honeymoon happening on the far side of it. In the morning, we mentioned it to the stewardess assigned to our corridor, a young woman named Priya, who'd been pleasant and efficient about everything else. Turned down service, breakfast trays, the whole performance of five-star hospitality. When we asked who was staying next door, she went very still for just a second, the kind of stillness you only notice because everything before it had been fluid and easy. And then she said that suite wasn't in service this crossing. Sealed for the season, she said. Nobody's been in there since Southampton. We told her we'd heard people, clearly, distinctly, through a wall Daniel swore was solid, and she said she'd note it for the chief steward, and then she found a reason to be somewhere else very quickly. It was the kind of exit that would have meant nothing on its own, except that over the next 2 days, every single time we brought it up again, she found another reason to be somewhere else. There was a corner of the suite, by the writing desk, where the temperature never matched the rest of the room, no matter what the crew did. We complained twice, and both times a maintenance man came and checked the vents, checked the radiator valve, ran some kind of thermal reader across the wall, and both times he found nothing wrong on paper, while standing in a spot that was, by his own reader, 6 degrees colder than 3 feet away. The second time, an older engineer came instead of the young one, and after he'd packed up his tools, he paused at the door and said, mostly to himself, that they used to call this one the cold cabin, back when the ship still ran the northern route in the 30s, and that some habits just don't leave a room, even after you gut it down to the rivets. Then he seemed to catch himself, like he'd said more than his job wanted him to, and he left before either of us could ask what he meant. We found the photograph 3 days into the crossing, in a display case in the corridor outside the first-class dining room, part of a little history exhibit about the ship's original 1933 maiden voyage. Rows of black and white faces, crew in stiff uniforms, passengers in furs, and near the bottom corner, a wedding portrait, a young couple standing at what was clearly this same deck's railing, her hand on his arm, both of them looking straight at the camera with the particular stillness people had before shutters got fast. Daniel stopped walking before I did. He didn't say anything, just pointed, and I looked, and the air went strange in my chest, because the man in that photograph had Daniel's exact jaw, his exact way of standing with his weight on one hip, and the woman had my mother's cheekbones, which are also mine, and a small gap between her front teeth that I have too. It could have been a coincidence of old photography and modern imagination. It could have been two people who simply looked like us the way any two people from any era might. But we stood there a long time not saying that out loud, because neither of us believed it. The ship kept a small archive room, more of a closet with a desk, staffed by a retired academic named Walsh, who'd been brought aboard specifically for the restoration project to catalog what survived. When we asked him about the couple in the photograph, he knew immediately which one we meant, said people asked about them more than any other picture in the case, and told us their names, and told us they'd been married in Southampton the morning they sailed, and had taken the same suite we were in now as a wedding gift from her father. Then he said, in the flat tone of someone reciting a fact he'd repeated many times, that the woman was found the next morning at the base of the aft stairwell, and the husband was never found at all, and the official log listed it as an accident involving heavy weather, though the weather that crossing had, according to the log itself, been unusually calm. When we went back to Priya with that, something in her finally cracked a little. She admitted, quietly, glancing toward the corridor first, that the crew were told at the start of every crossing not to discuss the history of Deck 2 with anyone booked into it. Not forbidden exactly, she said, just discouraged, strongly, by people above her pay grade. She said the company had learned a long time ago that couples loved the romance of a restored ship with a story, right up until the story got specific, and that specific was bad for business. She said guests had been upgraded into that suite before, more than once, always young couples, always on their first crossing together, and she didn't know whether that was tradition or superstition, or just an algorithm nobody questioned anymore. But she knew it wasn't random, because nothing on this ship was random anymore. Then she asked us, almost gently, whether anything else had happened, And when we told her about the wall and the cold corner, she just nodded slowly, like we'd confirmed something she already suspected, and told us she'd leave a lamp on in the corridor outside our door that night, though she didn't say why. 2 nights before we docked in New York, Daniel took his ring off before bed, the way he always did. Set it on the little dish on the nightstand next to mine. In the morning, both rings were gone from the dish. We found them eventually, sitting side by side on the closed lid of the writing desk across the room, lined up with a precision neither of us would have bothered with half asleep. And mine was on the left side, his on the right, though we'd always set them down the opposite way. Neither of us had gotten up in the night. Neither of us remembered even dreaming. It was Walsh, of all people, who put the last piece in place, almost by accident, when Daniel mentioned the date of the original couple's wedding just to make conversation. Walsh went quiet, checked something in his folder, and said that was in fact tonight's date, adjusted for the calendar shift the ship had made crossing the same waters at the same time of year, decades apart almost to the hour. He said it the way you'd mention a strange coincidence at a dinner party, not realizing what he'd just handed us. And he added, almost as an afterthought, that the restoration project had actually pulled records from 3 prior refits of this exact suite, going back to when the ship first came out of dry dock as a cruise vessel in the 70s. And in every single one of those refits, a young couple on their first crossing had reported something in that room. Some of them left the ship early at the next port and never spoke to each other again, according to insurance claims and a couple of very brief newspaper mentions. Others stayed married for the rest of their lives and, according to the few interviews the shipping line had ever bothered to keep on file, never once explained what had happened, only that whatever it was, it had made them certain of each other in a way nothing else ever had. That last night, the wall sounds didn't stop when the champagne clink and laughter usually faded into silence, the way they had every other night. They kept going, quieter, into something that sounded less like celebration and more like 2 people repeating something back and forth to each other. Low, rhythmic, almost like reciting, and underneath it, so faint I might have imagined it except that Daniel heard it too, and gripped my hand without either of us discussing it, our own names, or something close enough to our names that neither of us has ever been able to say for certain whether we heard them or supplied them ourselves in the moment. We woke up on the balcony, not in the bed, on the balcony, in the freezing dark somewhere past 3 in the morning, both of us standing at the rail with our hands joined the way you hold hands during a ceremony, and I had this feeling, whole and complete and impossible to argue with, that I had just said something out loud to someone, that I had just promised something, and Daniel, before I'd said a single word about it, turned to me with his face white from more than the cold, and said he felt exactly the same thing, that he'd just repeated our vows, out loud, to no one he could see, and that some part of him was certain it had been received. We never told the crew. We never told Priya, even though I think she already knew from the way she looked at us over breakfast the next morning, kind and a little sad, like someone watching a pattern complete itself again. We didn't discuss it much between ourselves either. Not then, not really since, except once, years later, on a different anniversary entirely, half asleep in our own bed, in a house nowhere near any ocean, when Daniel turned his ring absently on his finger, the way he does when he's thinking, and said, out of nowhere, that he wondered sometimes if we were still the second couple in that story, or if by now we'd become the first. I didn't ask him what he meant. I already understood it, the same way I understood, when I finally looked closely enough one afternoon, years after the crossing, that the engraving inside my ring, the one I'd chosen myself from a jeweler in London, had a small mark near the band I'd never noticed before and could not explain, a mark that matched nothing in the receipt, nothing in the design we'd picked out together, nothing either of us had ever asked for. I showed it to Daniel once. He looked at it a long time, then looked at me, and neither of us said anything at all, and we've left it that way ever since, something we both carry, and neither of us explains, quiet, unresolved, entirely our own. The wedding had been 3 weeks earlier, in a garden outside Charleston, And the honeymoon was supposed to be the easy part. 14 nights on a ship that moved through the South Pacific like it had nowhere urgent to be, stopping at reef towns and volcanic islands, and, on the 9th day, a private atoll, the cruise line used only for day trips. No hotel on it, no dock lights, just a crescent of white sand, a supply hut for the excursion staff, and water so clear it looked painted on. Elise had read the itinerary twice before they left home. Wet season, it said, in small print under the atoll's name. Tender service ends at sundown, weather permitting. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. It read like the kind of caution airlines put on peanut packets. The day started easy. Snorkeling off the reef shelf, a barbecue lunch under thatched umbrellas, Marcus teasing her about the sunscreen she kept missing on the back of her neck. He'd gone in for a second swim after lunch, and she'd stayed on the sand a while longer, chasing the light for photos, the kind of shots that look staged but aren't. By the time she packed up her camera, the beach had thinned out, a few families still drying off near the huts, a crew member walking the shoreline, checking wristbands against a tablet, moving people toward the tender line in that particular rhythm of someone racing a clock they weren't explaining. She got in line behind a man she didn't recognize, mid-40s maybe, sunburned in the specific way of someone who doesn't usually holiday somewhere this bright. He had a dry bag over one shoulder, and the loose, unhurried manner of a person who'd been traveling alone long enough to stop minding it. They didn't speak. She was still looking for Marcus, scanning the water, when the deckhand at the front of the line held up his tablet and said something into his radio she didn't quite catch. The tender pulled away with 30-some passengers on it. Marcus wasn't one of them. Neither was she. She wasn't panicked yet. There'd be another one. There always was. The deckhand who'd stayed behind to lock up the equipment shed told her, almost apologetically, that this had been the last run. A squall line was building northeast of the atoll, visible now as a gray wall stacking up over the horizon, and the captain wanted all tenders secured before it hit. He said the ship would send someone back once the weather cleared. He said it the way people say things they've been told to say. That was when she first noticed the man from the line was still there too, sitting on an overturned cooler a little way off, watching the horizon like he already knew how this would go. What stayed with her longest, later, was the moment right before the last tender left. She'd been standing close enough to hear the deckhand radio the ship. 32 of 32, he said, all accounted for. She remembered it exactly, because she was standing on the sand at that moment, in plain sight, not on the boat, and the number came back whole anyway. She told herself it was a scanner glitch, a wristband read twice. She told herself that for a long time. The man introduced himself as Tom. He said he was a marine biologist finishing up a coral survey for a research partnership the cruise line sponsored, which was why he'd been out past the flagged swim line when the recall whistle blew. He had an easy way of explaining things, technical enough to sound credible, vague enough that she couldn't have repeated any of it back. He offered her his jacket when the wind picked up. He didn't seem worried, and for the first hour, that was a comfort. Someone being calm felt like permission to be calm too. They found the equipment shed unlocked, meant for storage, not shelter, stacked with folded umbrellas and a first aid kit, and a marine radio bolted to a shelf. Tom went to it first, confident, like he'd used one before, and worked through the channels while she watched the squall line thicken in the distance. Nothing came back but static, and then not even that. He popped the back panel to check the battery, and went quiet for a second too long before he said it looked dead. Must be the humidity. These things corrode fast out here. She believed him until she looked past his shoulder and saw the battery pack sitting to one side of the compartment. Not corroded, not swollen, just removed. Set down carefully, the way you set something down when you intend to come back for it. She didn't say anything about it. Not yet. She filed it the way you file a lot of small wrong things when you badly want the day to still make sense. The rain came in around 4. The kind of wet season downpour that doesn't build slowly. It just arrives. And they sat under the shed's tin overhang while it hammered the sand flat outside. Tom talked to fill the space. He mentioned, offhand, that he'd sailed this same route last year, back when the atoll stop was new. She let it pass the first time. The second time he said it, she asked when exactly, because she remembered reading in the excursion brochure that this stop had only been added to the itinerary 8 months ago. He laughed it off, said he must be thinking of a different island. There were so many out here that blurred together. Then, a little later, trying to be kind, he said something about how nice it must have been, the wedding, and used Marcus's full name. She hadn't said Marcus's last name to him. She was almost sure of that. When she asked how he knew it, he said she must have mentioned it earlier, and maybe she had. People say more than they remember when they're nervous. But it sat wrong in her chest, the way a wrong note sits wrong in a song you know well. By early evening, the rain thinned to a mist, and the light went the color of a bruise, healing purples and greens low over the water. The ship was visible from the beach, a smear of white a couple of miles out, lit up window by window as the sky behind it darkened. She watched it and realized, with a small physical lurch, that it wasn't getting closer. If anything, the lights looked smaller than they had an hour before. Ships reposition overnight in places like this, hold position offshore in deeper water, where the wind can't push them onto a reef. Nobody had told her that. She'd assumed it would just sit there, waiting, the way a car waits in a driveway. Full dark came fast, the way it does close to the equator. No long dusk to ease into it. The generator in the shed ran a single bulb over the door, and nothing else. Tom built a small fire on the sand out of driftwood and packaging from the first aid kit, which she should have found strange and didn't. Not right away, because the fire was warm and the bugs had started, and she was cold and scared and grateful for anything that felt like being taken care of. It was somewhere around 9, with the ship's lights a fixed, useless smear on the black water, and the two of them sitting close to the fire, because the alternative was the dark, that she noticed the shift in him. Not menace exactly. Something quieter and harder to name. He'd stopped filling silences. He watched the water instead of her, and there was an ease in his shoulders that hadn't been there at 3 in the afternoon, when being stranded still looked like an inconvenience to solve. He looked, she thought, like a man who had finally arrived somewhere he'd been trying to get to for a while. She asked him, straight out, who he actually was, because the marine biologist story had thinned to nothing over 6 hours of small contradictions. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he told her his name wasn't Tom. It was Aaron. He said he wasn't with the ship's research program. He'd booked passage under a different name because that was the only way to get a cabin 2 decks from theirs without raising questions. And he'd been on this ship for 9 days trying to work out how to say what he was about to say without her thinking he was insane or dangerous. And now, marooned on a beach with nowhere for either of them to walk away to, he didn't have a choice about the timing anymore. He said he was a private investigator. He said Marcus's first wife hadn't died the way the coroner's report said she did. Elise knew about Renata. Everyone did. Distantly. The way you know a fact about someone without ever touching the edges of it. A boating accident off Vanuatu, 2 years before she and Marcus had even met. A tragedy that had made him careful, he'd told her once. A little quieter than usual. The kind of careful that made her love him more, not less. Aaron said the file had been closed faster than these things usually close. That a friend of Renata's sister had never stopped asking questions. That he'd been retained 8 months ago to look into inconsistencies nobody official had wanted to chase. He said he'd followed the engagement, then the wedding, then the honeymoon booking, and told himself the whole time he was probably chasing nothing, right up until this morning, when he watched a deckhand mark a manifest complete with Elise, standing on the sand in plain view of the boat. She wanted, badly, not to believe him. It would have been so much easier not to. But things she'd folded away without looking at started coming back out now, lined up differently than they had that morning. Marcus choosing this exact cruise from 3 the travel agent had offered, this exact excursion day, when he usually left the planning to her, a signature she'd given without much thought, 3 days before the wedding, on paperwork he'd called boring but necessary, that she now realized she couldn't fully recall the language of. A comment from one of the crew at breakfast, days ago, mentioning that Marcus had asked, almost too casually, how the tender count worked on excursion days, whether it was manual or automatic. She'd thought it was just Marcus being Marcus, curious about how things worked. She wasn't sure anymore what that curiosity had been for. Neither of them slept. The fire burned down to coals sometime after 2, and they sat either side of it not talking, both watching the same fixed lights on the water. Both, she understood, without either of them saying it, afraid of a version of the night that hadn't happened, and grateful, in a thin, exhausted way, not to be facing it alone. The supply boat came in with the gray light just after 5, running its normal Tuesday resupply for the excursion's kitchen, and the crew on it hadn't even been told anyone was missing. Somewhere on the ship, the story that got radioed back later was that Marcus had asked security to hold off sending anyone across in the dark, that the weather made a night rescue too risky, that he'd spent the hours pacing the upper deck sick with worry, and that was the story everyone on board was already telling by the time the supply boat brought them in. Ship security met them at the gangway and took Aaron aside for questioning that lasted most of the morning. He hadn't broken any law that anyone could point to. Booking under a professional alias wasn't a crime. Being stranded wasn't a crime. Removing a radio battery, if anyone had even thought to check, could always be explained as maintenance, and nobody was looking hard enough to disprove it. By early afternoon, he was released with his belongings and a warning about ship conduct policy, and Elise watched from the rail as a tender took him to shore at the next port, alone, without either of them having said whatever there was left to say. Marcus was waiting for her outside their cabin with his arms already open, his voice cracking in the right places, and it should have felt like relief, and some small, stubborn part of her wanted it to. She let him hold her. Over his shoulder, she watched the crew member from the front desk hand him back his room key, and she noticed, in the flat, useless way you notice things your mind won't let you use yet, that his hands were perfectly dry. No salt crust, no damp. Nothing like a man who'd stood out in that squall all night, worried sick the way he kept saying he had. She didn't tell him what Aaron had said. She didn't know how to, not without sounding like the kind of woman people worry about, and not without having to explain why, 3 weeks into her marriage, she'd started asking the cabin steward to knock twice before entering, why she left the balcony door locked even in the heat, why she found small, plausible reasons to never be alone with her husband in a room without a window facing the corridor. He noticed, of course he noticed, and asked her gently, more than once, what was wrong, whether the island had frightened her that badly. She told him it had. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole of it, and she understood, watching him wait for the rest of an answer she was never going to give him, that she had 11 more days on this ship, married to a man she used to think she knew completely, and no way now to be alone with him again, without wondering if the water outside their window was closer than it looked. The ship pulled out of Barcelona a little after 5 in the afternoon, and Mara stood at the railing on deck 7 with a plastic cup of sparkling wine going warm in her hand, watching the spires of the cathedral shrink into the haze behind them. Daniel had his arm around her waist, and he smelled like the sunscreen he always wore too much of, and he kept saying the word repositioning like it amused him, like the ship itself was a piece of furniture being dragged across an ocean instead of a 14-night crossing from the Mediterranean to Fort Lauderdale. 10 years married that week, a shoulder season sailing, half the price of summer, an interior cabin midship on deck 6, because Daniel got seasick and midship was supposed to move the least. It felt, for the first 2 hours, like the best decision they had made in years. It was that night, while he was getting changed for the first formal dinner, that she noticed the scar was on the wrong arm. She knew the story, the way you know your own address. 19 years old, climbing a chain-link fence behind his parents' house on a dare, the wire catching his forearm and opening a gash he still had to explain to strangers at the beach. She had touched that scar 1,000 times. It sat on his right forearm, just below the elbow, a thin, pale line like a fingernail dragged through wet paint. Except tonight, buttoning his shirt in the fluorescent light of their windowless cabin, the scar was on his left. She almost said something. She actually opened her mouth. Then she thought about how she'd once told her mother the wrong year they got engaged, how she still sometimes typed her old phone number by accident, and she closed her mouth and told herself she had always been bad with left and right, that everyone was, that under bad lighting a mirror could turn a person around in your head without you noticing. She let it go. She was good at letting things go. It was a skill she was proud of, actually, until this trip made her wonder if it wasn't a skill at all, but a habit that had been trained into her. The second night undid a little more of that confidence. They were at the bar off the atrium, and she brought up the wedding, the way you do after 2 drinks, the night it rained indoors, their favorite story, the one they'd told at every dinner party for a decade, the sprinkler system going off during the best man's toast, water pouring down over 200 people in their good clothes, her father laughing so hard he had to sit on the floor. Daniel laughed along with her, right on cue. But when she got to the part about the flower girl flipping the panic switch by the fire exit, he corrected her. No, he said, it was the officiant. Leaning back against the wall during the vows, that was who set it off. She stared at him. It had never been the officiant. It had always been the flower girl, his cousin's daughter, 6 years old, bored out of her mind. He said it with such ease that for a second, she doubted herself instead of him. At dinner the next evening, she brought the scar up, gently, phrasing it like a joke. I could have sworn that was on your other arm. He looked down at his own forearm like he was checking, then smiled and said something about how scars migrate a little as you get older. Skin moves, muscle changes shape underneath it. It was a smooth answer. It was also, she was almost certain, not a real thing that happened to scars. Then the waiter learned his name. It was the third night, formal night, and their assigned table was run by a career waiter named Marcus, who had the kind of practiced warmth cruise staff perform for strangers. Except Marcus didn't perform it for Daniel. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder like they'd shared a foxhole somewhere and said, "Welcome back, sir. I hope the crossing treats you kinder this time." And Daniel's face did something complicated. A half-second of nothing before the polite confusion set in. He told Marcus he'd never sailed this line before in his life. Marcus apologized, blamed a mix-up with another guest, moved on to pour the wine. But Mara watched his eyes flick to Daniel twice more over the course of the meal. The way you look at someone you're trying to place. She told herself it was a coincidence, a resemblance. Cruise staff mixed up 1,000 faces a season. But that night, alone in the bathroom with the water running so he wouldn't hear, she took his passport out of the cabin safe and studied the signature page under the light. The photo was him, unmistakably him, the small gap in his front teeth, the crooked left eyebrow. But the signature, the one he'd signed 100 documents with over 10 years of marriage, ended differently. His D always looped back on itself at the bottom, a little flourish he was embarrassed by. This D didn't loop. It just stopped. She put the passport back and didn't sleep much. 2 nights later she found the note. He'd left it on the little desk in their cabin, a reminder to himself about a shore excursion time, numbers and a departure gate, written in his usual all-caps scrawl. Except the slant was wrong, tilted the other way, like someone left-handed trying to imitate a right-handed man's habits and not quite landing it. She stood there holding it long enough that her hand started to shake. Then she folded it and put it in her book, a page marker for a novel she wasn't reading anymore. She started testing him without telling herself that was what she was doing. She asked about his childhood dog, casual, mid-conversation. What was the name of that mutt your dad had before you were born? The one in all the photo albums. Biscuit, he said. Correct, exactly correct. But there was a half-beat before he said it, a pause that felt less like memory and more like retrieval. The difference between knowing your own name and looking it up. On the 5th day, somewhere off the coast of Gibraltar, she found herself scrolling through his phone while he showered, telling herself she was just checking the weather app for their next port. A folder of old photos loaded instead, years back, before they'd met, and there was a picture of him on a beach she didn't recognize, laughing, his arm around a woman she had never seen in 10 years of marriage. When she asked him about it later, casually, he said it was a work conference in Portugal, a colleague, nothing. The explanation fit together fine. It was reasonable. It also didn't stop her hands from being cold for the rest of the day. The bartender in the aft lounge, a young Greek man named Nikos, told her the next afternoon that her husband had come in earlier, looking a little green around the gills. Must be the swell picking up. She had been with Daniel the entire morning. They had been in the cabin together, then at the gym together, then at lunch together. There had been no window in which he could have gone anywhere alone. She didn't correct Nikos. She just ordered her drink and carried it back to the cabin and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the low mechanical hum that never quite stopped on a ship. The sound she'd once found soothing, and now found impossible to ignore. By the 6th day they were fully into open Atlantic, the coast gone, the internet reduced to a satellite trickle that dropped every few minutes, and something about the absence of land did something to her chest, a tightness that hadn't been there in the Mediterranean legs of the trip. There was no one to call, nothing to check against, just gray water in every direction, and 11 more days of it. She caught herself standing at the balcony door of a cabin that didn't have a balcony, staring at a wall, before she realized what she was doing. She managed, that night, to get enough signal to message her sister, half joking, asking her to settle an old argument, whether it had been Daniel or their friend Pete who'd driven them home from the airport the week they got engaged. It felt safe, a memory outside the marriage, something with a witness. Her sister wrote back an hour later, "Pretty sure it was you who drove, Mara. You'd just gotten your new car." Mara read it 3 times. She was positive, had always been positive, that she didn't drive that night, that she'd been too excited, too caffeinated, that Daniel had driven with the windows down the whole way. Now, she wasn't sure whose memory was wrong, her sister's or her own. And for the first time, the fear wasn't only about Daniel. It was about whether her own mind could be trusted as a witness to anything at all. That was the night she went looking through her toiletry bag for the small orange bottle she'd packed out of habit more than need. An anti-anxiety prescription she'd been on for years, low dose, mostly for sleep. It was 3 days short of what it should have been. She did the math twice. Somewhere between packing and boarding, she'd lost 3 days of medication. And she had no memory of taking them, and no memory of not taking them either, which was somehow worse. She sat on the closed toilet lid with the bottle in her hand and thought, not for the first time that week, that maybe this was just her, misfiring. And Daniel was exactly who he'd always been. And she was the one coming slightly unmoored on a ship in the middle of an ocean with nothing to hold on to. It didn't stop her. 2 days later, she went to the guest services desk on Deck 5, under the pretense of a billing question, and asked, as casually as she could manage, to see the onboard account activity for their cabin, the record of where the key cards had been swiped. The woman behind the desk didn't blink, printed it without question. Mara read it standing at the counter. Tuesday morning, the morning he'd told her he was on the jogging track working off the buffet, his card had been swiped at the casino on Deck 4, twice, 40 minutes apart. She folded the paper into a small square and put it in her bag, and didn't bring it up at dinner, because she didn't trust her own voice not to shake. That evening, back in the cabin, she dug through her wallet for an old birthday card he'd written her 7 years ago, one she'd carried through 3 purses because she liked the way he'd signed it. She laid it next to the note she'd taken from the desk. Some of the letters matched exactly, the same lazy loop on his lowercase g, the same flat-top T. Others didn't match at all. It wasn't a stranger's handwriting. It was close enough to be unsettling, in a way a stranger's handwriting never could have been. Half of him on the page, and half of somebody else. Lying awake that night, she found herself doing something she was almost ashamed of, searching the ship's spotty Wi-Fi for stories about people who'd realized, months or years into a relationship, that something fundamental about their partner didn't line up. Cases that were never solved, never explained, just quietly absorbed into a life. She read 3 of them before she made herself stop. It didn't help. It only gave the fear a shape, a genre, a sense that this was a known category of thing that could happen to a person, and that made it worse, not better. On the 9th night, 3 drinks into dinner, she asked him outright, "Are you my husband?" She said it lightly, like a joke. but her hands were flat on the table to keep them from shaking. He laughed first, a real laugh, and for a second she felt stupid and relieved at once. Then he saw her face wasn't laughing with him, and the laugh died, and something crossed his features that looked like hurt, real hurt, the kind you can't fake on command. Then, underneath the hurt, a stillness she didn't like, a beat too long before he reached for her hand and said, "Of course I am. Mara, what is going on with you this trip?" It was the right answer. It was also, she realized later, exactly the answer either version of him would have given. He tried, gently, to prove it to her. He brought up the year her father died, the specific way she'd cried in the hospital parking garage, before either of them said a word, a detail she had never told anyone but him. It should have settled everything. For one whole evening it did. Then she remembered, lying in bed at 3 in the morning, that she'd written about that same parking garage in a grief support forum, years before they'd even started dating seriously, under a username that wasn't hard to trace back to her real name, if someone wanted to look. The proof that should have been unimpeachable turned out to be something anyone patient enough could have found. 2 nights later, she was looking for a nail clipper in his shaving kit and found a second wedding band tucked into the mesh pocket. Gold, a slightly different weight than the one on his finger. Her stomach dropped through the floor of the cabin. She was still holding it, turning it over in the bathroom light, when the alarm went off for an unscheduled muster drill. 3 long blasts, crew banging on doors. Everyone funneled up to the assembly stations in their life jackets, while the ship's officers explained a minor mechanical check. Nothing to worry about. By the time they were let back down an hour later, exhausted and cold from the wind on deck, the ring was back in her hand from her own pocket, where she'd shoved it in the panic of the drill. And when she finally asked him about it the next morning, he said it was a spare. The original had needed resizing years ago, and he'd never gotten around to returning the loaner from the jeweler. It was a strange thing to still be carrying around. It was also infuriatingly plausible. An older woman in the elevator, small and sharp-eyed, told Mara on the 11th day that she recognized her husband from a crossing 2 years back, except she called him by a different name entirely. Robert. Was it Robert? She was almost sure it was Robert. Mara's pulse spiked before the woman's daughter, standing beside her, gently corrected her mother and apologized to Mara. Explained quietly, once the woman had wandered off toward the shops, that her mother mixed people up more and more these days. Confused rooms. Repeated the same stories 3 times in an hour. Mara nodded and said it was fine, of course, no trouble at all. But walking back to the cabin, she thought about how she herself had spent 11 days building a case out of half-memories and misplaced scars, and a handwriting sample from a card 7 years old. And she wondered, with a coldness that sat under her ribs for the rest of the day, whether she looked to Daniel exactly the way that woman had just looked to her. She started writing it all down anyway, a small notebook from the gift shop, and when that felt too exposed, she switched to voice memos on her phone, recorded in the bathroom with the fan running, dates and times, the scar, the joke, the waiter, the signature, the note, the dog's name and the half-second pause, the woman on the beach, the casino swipe, the 2 handwritings, the ring, the woman in the elevator. Cataloging it made her feel less crazy, and more crazy in exactly equal measure. Daniel noticed, of course. He couldn't not notice. Around the 12th day, he sat her down on the edge of the bed and took both her hands and told her, with what looked like real tenderness, that she hadn't seemed like herself this whole trip, that she was distant, jumpy, and that maybe when they got home, she should talk to someone, her doctor, a therapist, just to check in. It was the kind of thing a loving husband says. It was also, if you turned it just slightly in the light, the exact thing someone would say if they needed her to distrust her own perception a little longer, a little more completely. She thanked him. She said maybe he was right. She had no way of knowing, in that moment, which one of those 2 things was true, and she was starting to understand that she might never know. On the 13th day, docked for a few hours in Ponta Delgada, with a sliver of real signal, she stepped away from him at the taxi stand and called Pete, the best man from their wedding. the one witness outside the marriage who'd known Daniel since they were boys. She asked him, trying to keep her voice light, whether it had really been the flower girl who set off the sprinklers that night, or the officiant. There was a pause on the line. Wind noise. Pete half laughing and saying honestly, "Mara, it's been 10 years. I couldn't swear to it either way anymore. Why?" And then the call dropped, the signal gone, the little bars on her phone collapsing to nothing, right as she opened her mouth to explain. She stood on the dock in Ponta Delgada, holding a dead phone, the ship behind her white and enormous against the volcanic hills, and understood that even the people who had known him longest than her didn't have a clean answer anymore. That memory simply wore down that way for everyone, evidence or not. On the last night, the ship gliding toward the lights of Fort Lauderdale on the horizon, they stood together at the railing the way they had on the first night out of Barcelona, and he reached over and took her hand in the exact particular way he always had, his thumb finding the same spot on her knuckle without looking, a small unconscious habit 10 years deep that no amount of research or coaching could easily replicate. For one full breath, the fear let go of her completely. He was her husband. He was simply, entirely her husband, and she had spent 2 weeks frightening herself over scars and handwriting and a stranger's confused memory. Then the deck lights caught his forearm as he lifted his drink, and the scar was still there on the left side, pale and thin, exactly where it shouldn't be, and she felt the fear settle back into her chest, like it had never really left at all, just gone quiet for a moment to let her catch her breath. Nothing was ever proven. Not that trip. Not in the years after. She never found a document, a confession, a moment that cracked the whole thing open one way or the other. What she found instead was a life that continued almost exactly as it would have anyway. Birthdays and mortgage payments, and a second decade of marriage that looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from the first. But she kept the notebook. She added to it quietly for years. A new entry every so often. A word he used that he'd never used before. A memory he told slightly differently at a dinner party. A scar that seemed, impossibly, to have moved again. She never showed it to anyone. She never stopped loving him, not exactly. And she never fully stopped believing he was hers, not exactly either. She simply learned to live in the space between those two things, awake most nights a little longer than she used to be, watching him sleep beside her, still trying, after all that time, to be sure. I've never told anyone the full version of this story, not even the friends who ask about our honeymoon and get the polished version with the Danube and the wine and the little town squares. My wife knows some of it. The rest I've carried on my own, and honestly, after 4 years, it feels like time to say it out loud. Mira and I got married in April and flew straight to Vienna to board a river cruise up the Danube. The kind of trip with a cocktail lounge on the top deck, rattan furniture, a bartender who remembered your drink by the second night. Spring on that river is soft, low light on the water, vineyards just starting to green up on the hills. We were exactly the kind of people you'd expect to see on a boat like that in the first week of marriage. A little sunburned, a little drunk on the idea of our own life starting, holding hands over dinner like we'd invented the gesture. That's where we met Nick and Elena. Second night out, at the bar on the sun deck, they sent over a bottle of something local and expensive. No explanation, just a toast across the room to the newlyweds. They were maybe 10 years older than us, easy in their own skin, in a way that made you want to sit closer to them, and within 20 minutes, it felt like we'd known them for years. Nick did most of the talking, told stories about business deals in 3 countries, laughed at his own jokes before he finished them. Elena watched everyone like she found people fascinating, which is a rare and flattering thing to have directed at you. Somewhere in that first conversation, Nick said something that should have stopped me cold and didn't. He mentioned that our wedding day must have been a relief once the rain finally broke for the ceremony. We hadn't told him about the rain. We hadn't told him anything about the wedding at all beyond the fact that we'd just had one. I remember laughing it off in the moment, some half-formed thought that maybe I'd mentioned it and forgotten. 3 glasses of wine deep, the kind of small gap in memory you don't examine too closely on your honeymoon. It wasn't until 2 nights later, lying in the cabin while Mira slept, that I actually opened Instagram and found the answer, and it landed harder than I expected. My sister had posted 40 photos from the wedding, tagged, geolocated, captions that mentioned the storm delay by name. Nick and Elena had never needed me to tell them anything. They'd read our whole wedding before they ever said hello to us at that bar, which meant the toast, the bottle of wine, the warmth, all of it had been aimed at us on purpose, days before we knew they existed. I didn't say any of this to Mira. I told myself I was being paranoid, that plenty of people scroll through a stranger's public photos out of simple curiosity, that it wasn't a crime to be a little too online about people you just met. But I started listening differently after that. 2 days later, over dinner, I asked Nick a casual question about his real estate firm in Toronto, something that should have had an easy, boring answer, and he hesitated just slightly too long before giving me a version that didn't quite match what he'd told us the first night. The office had moved. The partner's name had changed. Small stuff, forgettable stuff, unless you were already looking for cracks. I looked him up that night in the ship's business center, and Elena too, and found nothing. No firm, no listings, no social media beyond a single private Facebook profile with 9 friends, and a profile picture too small to make out clearly. People who talked as much as Nick did about their success usually left some kind of footprint. These two had almost none, and the little they had felt built rather than lived in. Still, I didn't say anything. This is the part that shames me the most, looking back. I had 2 separate, concrete reasons to be suspicious of these people within the first 4 days of my marriage, and I said nothing to my wife, because I didn't want to be the guy who ruined the honeymoon by being weird about some friendly couple we'd met on a boat. So when Nick leaned in on the 5th night and told us, in a voice pitched just for the 2 of us, that he knew a place the tour groups never saw, a private vineyard an hour outside our next port, family-run, invitation only, and that he didn't usually do this for people he'd just met, but there was something about us he liked, I said yes, before I'd even looked at Mira's face. She wasn't sure. She said it quietly after they'd gone back to their cabin. Something about how fast we'd all gotten close, how Elena asked a lot of questions and answered very few. I remember getting defensive about it, telling her she was overthinking a nice gesture from nice people, that this was exactly the kind of story we'd want to tell later. The secret vineyard nobody else on the boat got to see. I talked her into it. I want that on the record, because everything after this was my decision, not hers. The next morning we docked early, and Nick told us to meet our guide at a small pier away from where the ship's official excursions were loading. No ship staff present, no lanyards, no clipboard with our names on it. The guide was a thin man in his 50s who didn't smile once, and the first thing he asked for was cash, up front, no receipt, more than felt reasonable for a 2-hour drive. When I hesitated, he said something odd. He referred to Nick as your friend from the agency, not by name, like he'd been told there'd be a couple, but hadn't actually met the man arranging this himself. That should have been the moment I turned around. I paid him anyway. Before we left, some instinct made me walk back to the ship's concierge desk to ask if this vineyard trip was one of theirs, just to be safe, just to be able to tell Mira I'd checked. The woman at the desk looked through her list twice and told me, quite plainly, that no excursion matching that description existed on their books, and that the ship would be departing that evening on schedule, regardless of any private arrangements guests made on their own. She said it kindly, but it landed like a small stone in my stomach. We weren't on anyone's list. If something happened to us out there, there would be no record that we'd ever left the dock. We went anyway. The drive was beautiful. Hills and pale green vines and small stone farmhouses, and for a while, I let myself believe it had all been nothing. A strange but harmless coincidence, stacked on top of another. The guide dropped us at the top of a hill above a vineyard that did exist, that did have a small tasting room, and told us to enjoy ourselves, that he'd be back in 90 minutes with Nick and Elena, who were apparently coming separately after a stop in town. 90 minutes came and went, then 2 hours. The tasting room closed at 4, and the woman running it didn't speak much English. and grew visibly uneasy every time I tried to ask her to call someone. My phone had no signal at all, not even the single flickering bar I'd had in the van on the way up, and Mira's had none either. Dusk was maybe 90 minutes away. There was no town within walking distance that I could see, just hills and a single unpaved road running down toward wherever we'd come from, and the growing, physical understanding that the only two people who knew where we were, the only way back to that boat before it left without us, ran entirely through Nick and Elena, and they weren't answering. While we waited, pacing that gravel lot, I found the guide's van still parked around the side of the building, unlocked, the driver nowhere in sight. I don't know what made me look inside. There was a clipboard on the passenger seat, and on it, in handwriting I recognized instantly, because I'd watched him sign a bar tab with it 4 nights running, was Nick's actual signature, next to a phone number and the words, "Second Group, hold until dark." Not a guide hired by a stranger, a guide working directly for Nick, following Nick's own handwritten instructions, and the instruction was to hold us there until dark. That single piece of paper rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 5 days. This had never been about impressing 2 people they liked. It had never even been about robbing us out here on this hillside, because we had nothing on us worth the effort. No jewelry, a little cash, our passports back in the cabin safe. The realization came slow, and then all at once, the way cold water does when you're already half submerged. They didn't want anything from us out here. They wanted us out here, specifically, so that we would not be anywhere near our cabin while it happened. I have never run the way I ran down that hill. I found the tasting room owner again, pulled out every euro I had left, more than double what the guide had charged, and begged her in broken phrases and hand gestures to call anyone who could drive us back to the dock before the boat left. Her nephew had a car. He didn't ask questions, just drove too fast down roads that weren't built for it, and I sat in the back with Mira's hand crushed in mine, watching the light go orange and then gray, doing math in my head about departure times that I didn't actually know. We made the dock as the ship's horn was already sounding the final call, ran up the gangway past a crew member who looked at us like we were ghosts, and went straight to our cabin, not even stopping to breathe. The safe was closed. It looked untouched. For about 4 seconds, I actually believed we'd panicked over nothing, and then I saw the small scratch marks around the keypad, fresh, silver against the black plastic, and opened it to find the cash gift envelopes from Mira's family gone, and worse, far worse, my new wife's late grandmother's ring gone with it, the one thing in that safe that could never be replaced by any amount of insurance money. We went straight to Nick and Elena's cabin, empty, stripped down to the bare furniture, like no one had ever stayed there at all. The staff told us the couple had checked out that afternoon, hours before we'd even reached the vineyard, citing a family emergency back home, paid in full, no forwarding information, booked originally through a third-party travel agency the cruise line couldn't reach on a weekend. It was on the walk back to our own cabin that I remembered the photo. 3 nights earlier, during a stupid drunk card game, Nick had waved his passport around as a joke about some visa story, and I'd snapped a photo of it laughing, the kind of thing you do and forget. I found it in my camera roll, with hands that weren't entirely steady, zoomed in on the passport photo, and stared at a face that was similar to Nick's, close enough to fool exhausted eye at a bar, but not the same man. Different ears, different set to the jaw, a stolen or borrowed document, good enough to pass a casual glance, and nothing more. I never reported any of it. That's the part I still sit with. I told the crew about the missing ring and the cash, filled out a form, and left out the guide, the vineyard, the stranding, the passport, all of it. Because by the time we were standing in that office, I was so ashamed of every decision I'd made over those 5 days that I couldn't make myself say the words out loud to a stranger with a clipboard. I told myself it wouldn't bring the ring back either way. The truth is, I didn't want anyone, including my own wife, to fully understand how many times I'd been handed a reason to stop and chosen instead to keep walking toward the people who were robbing us. Mira and I don't talk about it much anymore. We bought a new ring, a good one, and some anniversaries. I look at it on her hand and feel something that isn't quite grief, and isn't quite guilt, but sits close to both. I still notice, on every trip since, when someone is a little too warm, a little too fast, when a stranger seems to already know something about me they shouldn't. I've gotten quieter around people like that. Mira noticed the change before I ever explained it, and when I finally did, all she said was that she'd known something was wrong on that hillside long before I let myself admit it. I think about that more than anything else from the whole trip. Not the ring, not the money, just the fact that she saw it coming, and I was the one who said yes anyway. I've told this story to maybe a dozen people since it happened, and every time I get to the part about the letter that showed up 8 months later, somebody asks me what actually caused it. I still don't have an answer. That's the part that sits with me longer than the rash itself did. How quietly the whole thing got handled, how close we came to just accepting we'd never know, and how nobody on that ship ever said a single word out loud that matched what we were actually watching happen around us. We booked the cruise the winter before, a Western Caribbean run out of a Gulf port, 7 nights. The kind of trip you pick because the flights are cheap and you need something to look forward to. September sailing, which meant hurricane season, which meant the price was good, and the captain's updates about a system forming southeast of us became part of the daily routine before we'd even hit the first port. We didn't think much of it. You get used to that language on a late summer cruise. Our cabin was an interior room on deck 2, booked for the price more than the location, and if you've ever stayed that low on a ship, you know what that means. You're a floor above the crew areas, close enough to the galley that the wall behind our bed ran warm around dinner service, and some nights the vent pushed in a smell of fryer oil and dish soap that never fully cleared out. My wife, Dana, joked that we were basically living behind a restaurant kitchen. Neither of us minded. It was a week off, and that's all we were looking for. The first few days went the way they always go. Muster drill, a sea day, a slow settling into the rhythm of buffet lines and pool chairs. On day 3, we stopped at a port along the Yucatan coast and did the kind of half-day excursion you do without thinking twice. A beach club, sometime in the water, a walk through a market stall area on the way back to the ship. Dana got a little sunburned on her shoulders, nothing that seemed worth mentioning, and we were back on board by late afternoon, showered, and at dinner by 7, like nothing had happened. By the time we got back to the cabin that night, she had a patch on her forearm. Small, red, a little raised, the kind of thing either of us would have called a bug bite or a reaction to sunscreen, and gone to bed without another thought. We did go to bed without another thought. That's the part I keep coming back to, because by morning it wasn't a patch anymore. It had spread down past her elbow and up onto her shoulder, in hours, while she slept, faster than any bite or rash either of us had ever seen move on a person. It wasn't just red. It was raised in ridges, warm when I touched it, and she said it didn't itch so much as it burned, low and steady, like a mild sunburn from the inside. I've had poison ivy. I've had heat rash. I've watched an allergic reaction happen to a kid at a birthday party once. Red welts blooming in real time. This didn't move the way any of those things move. It moved like something with momentum. We went down to the infirmary first thing, and I'll say the doctor was pleasant enough, quick, professional in that clipped way ship doctors are when they've got a line of people behind you. He looked at her arm for maybe 40 seconds, said it looked like a heat rash aggravated by sun exposure, and maybe a new sunscreen or a plant contact from the beach excursion, wrote her a script for hydrocortisone, and had a nurse hand us a folder with paperwork already half filled out. Cabin number blank, date blank, everything else pre-printed, like the form itself had been built for this exact conversation before we'd ever walked in the door. The visit cost more than I expected, the kind of number that makes you wince a little, even when you're not thinking about it twice. And we left with a tube of cream and the sense that we'd been moved through a process rather than actually looked at. I didn't say anything to Dana about it then. It just sat there, a small itch of its own. The next afternoon, we were up at the pool deck, and I noticed a woman a few chairs down with the same pattern on her calf, the same raised ridges, the same shade of red that wasn't quite sunburn and wasn't quite hives. I almost said something and didn't. Later that day, in the elevator, I overheard a couple behind us. The husband telling someone on the phone that his wife had some kind of rash thing. Everybody on this deck seems to have it. And I turned around without meaning to, and he gave me a look like he'd said too much. That was the first time it stopped feeling like something that had happened to us specifically. That evening, the buffet looked different, and nobody told us why. The salad bar was gone, replaced by a sealed case of pre-portioned cups. 2 of the stations that had been self-serve the whole cruise were suddenly staffed, tongs only, no touching. There were 3 new hand sanitizer stands at the entrance where there'd been one, and the crew behind the line were all in gloves they hadn't been wearing 2 nights before. No announcement, no sign explaining any of it, just a quiet rearrangement of the whole room, the kind of change you'd only notice if you'd been paying close enough attention to know what it used to look like. I asked our cabin steward about it the next morning, half joking, said something like, "Did somebody get sick or what?" expecting him to laugh it off. He didn't laugh. He looked down the hallway both ways first, which told me more than what he said next. And then he said, quiet, almost apologetic, that this had happened on the last sailing too. Same time of the trip, same part of the ship, and that they'd been told not to talk about it with guests. Then he changed the subject and started telling me about the pool towel policy, like the last 30 seconds hadn't happened. That night I couldn't sleep, so I got on the ship's slow, overpriced Wi-Fi and started digging through old cruise forums, looking for the ship's name, alongside words like rash and reaction and outbreak. I found a handful of posts, most of them a year or 2 old, vague complaints about skin irritation on this same ship, a couple of them oddly worded, like they'd been edited after the fact, a sentence that trailed off mid-thought, a reply that referenced a detail no longer in the post above it. One thread had clearly had responses stripped out of it, the numbering jumping from a comment 3 straight to comment 9. I'm not someone who goes looking for conspiracies. I just noticed that the pattern wasn't new, and that somebody, at some point, had gone back and cleaned some of it up. The next day, restless, I walked the length of our hallway and found a service door near the stairwell that I'd walked past a dozen times without registering it. It was propped open that afternoon, and past it I could see 2 crew members running a thick hose from what looked like a laundry room, the smell coming out of it sharp and chemical, more like a pool deck than a kitchen. I hadn't clocked until then that our cabin wasn't just near the galley, it was near where they processed all the linens for the whole ship, sheets and towels for every cabin, cycled through some kind of industrial wash a few doors down from where we slept every night. Nobody had said a word about that when we booked the room. I don't know if it means anything. I've never been able to find out. By the 5th day, it wasn't just Dana and the woman by the pool and the couple from the elevator. I counted at least 6 people over 2 days with the same marks, in different stages, some worse than what Dana had. One older man with it up his neck. And what struck me wasn't that people were sick. Cruises get norovirus. Everybody knows that going in. It was how the ship handled it. Nobody was told to report to the infirmary. Instead, medical staff started coming to cabins directly. A nurse knocking on our door unannounced on day 6, just to check Dana's arm, without either of us calling for her. The ship never changed course, never made an announcement, never did any of the things I'd expect if this were being treated like an actual outbreak. It was being managed, quietly, efficiently, cabin by cabin, like a leak being patched from the inside instead of a fire being put out in the open. I went to guest services on day 6, wanting an actual answer, something with a name attached to it, even if the name was ugly. The woman behind the desk was kind, apologetic, and completely unwilling to tell me anything specific. She offered us $200 in onboard credit for the inconvenience, and a form to sign acknowledging we'd received medical attention and had no further complaints against the line. I didn't sign it. I still have the $200 sitting unused on some account I've never bothered closing out. What got me wasn't the money. It was how fast it appeared. Like there was already a drawer full of these offers, sitting behind that desk, waiting for exactly this conversation. 2 days from the end of the cruise, the storm that had been a background detail all week turned into the reason for everything. We skipped our last port entirely. rerouted north to get ahead of the weather. And that night, the daily bulletin under our door explained the empty salad bar and the extra gloves as a precaution due to supply chain delays related to weather routing. I read that line 4 times. It didn't match anything I'd actually watched happen days before the storm had even formed into something with a name. It was the first time I understood, clearly, that the story we were being told and the thing we were living through were not the same story at all. Dana's rash started fading on day 7, the ridges flattening out, the color going from angry red to a dull pink that looked more like healing than symptom. By the time we disembarked, it had mostly gone quiet. Just some faint discoloration on her forearm that a friend later mistook for a fading sunburn. Mine had shown up too, lighter, on the back of one hand, and it faded around the same time hers did. Like whatever it was had run its course on its own schedule and had nothing left to do with a diagnosis or a name. Before we left the ship, the woman I'd seen by the pool caught me in the hallway waiting for the gangway line to move, and we traded emails, the way strangers do when they've shared something they can't quite explain to anyone who wasn't there. A few weeks later, she wrote to tell me she'd heard, secondhand, from someone who worked the laundry deck, that one of the crew members down there had been taken off the ship at our final port, not reassigned, medically disembarked, and that nobody on staff had been told why or where he'd gone. I never confirmed it. I have no way to confirm it. It's just something a stranger told me in an email, and it stayed in my head longer than it probably should have. Life went back to normal fast once we were home. The rash was a story we told at dinner parties for a month. Then it wasn't a story anymore. It was just something that had happened once. And then, 8 months later, an envelope showed up with a law firm's letterhead on it, a notice about a class action involving passengers on sailings from that ship across a 6-month window that included ours, referencing reported dermatological reactions of undetermined origin, and offering a claim form for anyone who could show medical documentation from the sailing. No pathogen named, no chemical named, no cause given at all, just careful legal language built to describe a problem without ever once explaining what the problem actually was. I filled out the form anyway. I sent in the folder from the infirmary, the one with the blank fields already half printed, before we ever sat down. That letter is still the closest thing to an answer I've ever gotten. And it isn't an answer. It's an acknowledgement that something happened to enough people, on enough ships, for someone with a legal department to finally do the math and decide it was cheaper to settle quietly than to ever say out loud what it was. I took the job on a Tuesday because a man named Dobrescu broke his wrist falling down a companionway stairwell in Southampton, and the agency needed a body that could start Friday. I'd worked hotels before, but never a ship, and never a crossing like this one, a repositioning run, the kind nobody wants, moving an aging vessel called the Corinthia out of her Mediterranean season and into winter Caribbean work by way of New York. 9 days, supposed to be, more if the weather turned, and in the North Atlantic in January the weather always turns. 400 and something passengers on a ship built to carry 1,400. A skeleton crew running a skeleton schedule. I was night steward on deck 9, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, turning down beds nobody had asked to have turned down, and walking trays to people too seasick to come find the dining room themselves. Deck 9 had 6 suites, and the forward one belonged to a couple on their honeymoon, Peter and Claire Ashworth. I knew their names because I'd seen the manifest sheet clipped to the pantry corkboard before anyone thought to tell me not to look at it. Late 20s, American, the sort of couple who book a 6-day January crossing because it sounds romantic in a magazine, not because anyone who's actually done one recommended it to them. The first thing I noticed wasn't much. The other 5 suites on my corridor got me, or got a colleague named Dragos, whoever was on rotation. Theirs got the assistant hotel director himself, a stiff, careful man named Salgado I'd otherwise never seen below deck 7, wheeling a service cart down at ours that made no sense for someone at his level to be doing steward's work. The Do Not Disturb sign stayed up around the clock, but the tray still went in anyway. I asked Dragos about it on a smoke break. He gave me the specific shrug people give when they've already decided a question isn't worth answering. Then, on the third night, I passed Peter Ashworth in the forward corridor, a little after 2 in the morning, barefoot, in a t-shirt, standing outside his own door like he'd forgotten which one it was. I asked if he needed anything. He looked at me a beat too long before he said he was fine, just couldn't sleep. The ship was loud. I told him that was normal on an old hull like this. The stabilizers groan in heavy swell. You get used to it by night 4. He nodded slowly, like the words took a while to arrive somewhere. I put it down to seasickness, or too much champagne. People do strange things on their honeymoons. 2 nights after that, the Ashworths stopped coming to the dining room. Nobody announced it. I only noticed because the maitre d', a woman named Fenwick, who ran the second seating like a small, strict country, quietly pulled their place setting from table 12, without a word to the waiter who'd served them all week. I asked her on my way past with a tray whether they'd switch to room service. She said something about a private arrangement and moved down the row to the next table before I'd finished my sentence. My own schedule changed a few days after that. I'd handled the whole forward corridor since day 1, all 6 suites. Now I was told Deck 9 forward was being managed separately, that I should stick to the aft cabins, and a senior steward I'd never worked a shift with was suddenly covering the Ashworth suite exclusively. Nobody explained why. On a ship this small, mid-crossing, reshuffling a routine like that isn't nothing. Somebody decides that on purpose. I found out how far the decision reached a couple of nights later, climbing the crew stairwell behind the galley around 4 in the morning. 2 officers were on the landing above me, not shouting, but not being careful either, the way people talk when they've assumed nobody's still awake to hear them. One of them, I recognized the voice. It was the staff captain. Said they weren't handling this the same way they'd handled it last crossing. The other one said something back I only caught the tail of, the word quietly, repeated twice. I stood on the step below them for 10 seconds before I made myself keep walking. Neither of them saw me. Last crossing. Not this one. I carried that phrase through the rest of my shift like a stone in my pocket. The warning came the next afternoon, before I'd even clocked in, which told me somebody had already reported me. Salgado found me in the crew mess and sat down across from me without being asked, which a man at his level doesn't do unless he means something specific by it. He said he understood I'd been asking questions about occupancy on Deck 9 forward. I hadn't asked anyone anything directly, not really. Apparently looking at a corridor too long counts. He told me, not unkindly, that cabin matters weren't steward business, that guest privacy was the one thing a ship like this actually sold, and that he'd hate for a misunderstanding to follow me onto my next contract. It wasn't a threat exactly. It worked like one anyway. I should have left it there. I told myself I would. But a few nights later, with 2 days left before New York, I was asked to cover a delivery to the forward suites, because the steward handling them had gone off sick, and there was nobody else free at that hour. The Ashworth door was cracked open when I got there. Nobody inside that I could see. I knocked, got nothing back, and because the tray in my hands needed somewhere to go, I pushed the door further than I should have. The bed was stripped to the mattress. Both suitcases were still there, unpacked, standing by the closet, like someone meant to come back for them any hour now. And against the far wall, the decorative fireplace unit these old suites have instead of proper heating vents had its front panel removed, tools laid out on a cloth on the floor beside it, a maintenance tag hanging off the grate that I didn't have time to read before I heard footsteps and put the tray down and left. The next morning, dropping paperwork at the purser's office because the regular runner was out, I saw the passenger log open on the front desk screen, angled toward me more by accident than anything. Ashworth, Claire, and Peter, Suite 9 forward. Status: disembarked. Passenger request: Horta 2. Horta is in the Azores. This ship never called at the Azores on this crossing. A straight repositioning line Southampton to New York, no stops. I'd heard the captain say so himself at the welcome muster. Whatever had happened to that couple, it hadn't happened at a port we'd visited, on a day we weren't even there. Somebody had typed a location into a system that both of us knew wasn't true. I didn't get an answer that day. I got one 3 nights later, my second to last shift, from a woman named Ilsa who ran the laundry and had been sailing on the Corinthia for 11 years, longer than most of the officers currently on the bridge. I asked her, carefully, whether she'd ever heard of a passenger transfer logged through Horta on a straight crossing. She didn't answer that directly. She told me this was the second time in 3 years. Deck 9 forward had gone quiet like this, in the middle of a winter run, and that the last time, she'd lost a friend over asking too many questions about it. Not lost as in died, lost as in the woman had simply not been rehired at the end of her contract. No reason given in writing. What Ilsa told me after that, I think she told me because she'd been carrying it alone for a while and needed somewhere to set it down. That suite's fireplace insert was original to the ship, decorative, and gas-fed, meant to have been capped off and dead for 20 years, but reconnected at some point because guests kept complaining the modern vents in that particular cabin never held heat in North Atlantic winter. Somebody some year, some maintenance order, had hooked it back up instead of fixing the ductwork properly, because fixing the ductwork meant pulling the most expensive suite on the ship out of service for a refit the company didn't want to pay for. In heavy weather, with the exterior vents icing over the way they do on an old hull in January, that unit doesn't draw right. It backs up into the room instead of out. It just makes a person tired and confused, and strange with the one they love, right up until it doesn't. I didn't sleep much after that. 2 nights before New York, Salgado found me again, this time with an envelope, cash, more than a week's tips, folded into a card, thanking me for my flexibility during a demanding crossing. He didn't say don't talk. He didn't need to. I understood the envelope exactly as clearly as I'd understood the warning in the mess hall, and I took it, because refusing would have told him something about me I wasn't ready to have known, and because I still had one more shift to get through on that ship. On my last night, I saw Claire Ashworth for the only time since that corridor conversation with her husband, 9 nights earlier. She was being walked up to the gangway ahead of general disembarkation, flanked by Salgado, and a woman I didn't recognize. Port liaison, maybe, or someone flown in from the company's shoreside office. She looked thin and pale in a way that wasn't just seasickness, and she was talking, quietly, about meeting her husband at a hospital in the city, about how they'd told her he was stable now, about hoping the flight hadn't been too hard on him in his condition. Nobody corrected her. Nobody looked at anyone else while she said it. I stood at my station with a stack of folded towels in my arms and did the one thing I'd apparently been hired, without anybody saying so out loud, to be good at. I said nothing. I watched her go. I finished the crossing. I clocked out in New York, collected my last envelope, and told the agency I wouldn't be taking the Caribbean season after all. Family reasons. Nothing they push back on. I never found out, not officially. Not in any way I could have repeated to someone who'd have believed me over a company's paperwork. What actually happened to Peter Ashworth? I've thought about calling someone, a reporter, the Coast Guard, whoever handles a shipping line's insurance claims, more times than I can count, and I still couldn't tell you what stopped me the first time, or what stopped me every time since. Some nights I tell myself I was one steward with no proof and no standing. That opening my mouth would have cost me everything and changed nothing. That the ship sails whether I speak or not. Other nights I think about a woman walking off a gangway, believing she was about to be reunited with her husband. And I understand that the only thing I actually protected that week was myself.